Welcome, friend. Close your eyes and imagine another time. The Vietnam War. A conflict that shaped nations, families, and futures. In this gentle retelling, we'll explore the events and voices of that era softly, steadily, so you can relax as history tells its story. Let's begin. Before the roar of helicopters, before the grainy footage of jungle firefights, before the acronyms and body counts, Vietnam was just a stretch of green on the map to most outsiders. But to the people who called it home, it was something far richer. A ribbon of rivers and rice paddies, mountains that cut the sky, a coastline that seemed to stretch forever, and villages that had stood for centuries. Understanding this land, its rhythm, and its people is like understanding why a storm brews. You can't explain the Vietnam War without first understanding Vietnam itself. Vietnam is long and narrow, like a bent bamboo stalk hugging the eastern edge of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. At its widest, it's barely 150 miles across. At its thinnest, it's about 30. To the west, rugged mountains hug Laos and Cambodia. To the east, the South China Sea shimmers like a restless neighbor. The north is a cradle of deltas, the Red River, rich and muddy, giving life to Hanoi and the ancient heartlands. The south is another story. The Mekong Delta, a maze of waterways and lush fields, the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia. These aren't just pretty postcards, they were battlefields waiting to happen. The rivers would move troops, hide enemies, and feed armies. The mountains would shelter guerrillas. The climate, monsoons, and relentless heat would exhaust even the best-equipped soldier. But here's the thing, for all its natural beauty, this land has always been hard to hold. Empires came and went, but the villages remained. Why? Because life in Vietnam was, and is, rooted in something older than politics: family, rice, and community. A single bamboo hedge could be as important as a government border. When you see photos of villagers with conical hats bent over rice paddies, you're seeing resilience, not quaintness. Long before anyone called it Vietnam, this region had a habit of saying no to outsiders. The Chinese tried for 1,000 years, starting in 111 BC. They built roads, introduced Confucianism, and demanded tribute. But the people here kept their own language, customs, and quiet defiance. Heroes like the Trung sisters, two warrior queens on elephants, rose up and briefly drove the Chinese out. Even in defeat, they became legend. The Vietnamese identity hardened like steel tempered in fire. We may bend, but we do not break. This habit of resistance wasn't just for China. Mongols, Khampa, Siamese, and later the French would all learn that Vietnam was not easily swallowed. Each invasion left scars, but also sharpened the sense of self. By the 19th century, when the French arrived with cannons and missionaries, they found a society that had already survived 1,000 years of pressure. Yet guns and ships were hard to resist forever, and Vietnam became part of French Indochina by the 1880s. Plantations bloomed, not for Vietnamese mouths but for export. The language of administration was French, but the language of the people stayed the same. Temples still smoked with incense, villages still passed down folk songs. The colonizers lived in white villas, but the farmers still bent their backs to the same rice. Resentment simmered. French rule wasn't just about politics, it was about pride. The French called it a civilizing mission, but to many Vietnamese it felt like theft. Land was seized, taxes were heavy, and a tiny educated elite was allowed a taste of Western schooling. The rest? Cheap labor. Yet here's the irony, that schooling planted ideas. Students read about liberty, equality, fraternity. They saw France fighting Germany and wondered why those same ideals didn't apply to them. The words of Rousseau and Marx trickled into Hanoi's cafes. It was like giving someone a locked door and then handing them the key. By the early 20th century, nationalist groups were forming. Some wanted a constitutional monarchy, others socialism, some just wanted the French gone. Then came a wiry, bookish young man named Nguyen Sinh Khanh, better known to history as Ho Chi Minh. He traveled the world, worked in kitchens, saw the West up close, and came back convinced that Marxism and nationalism could marry. His dream was simple: an independent Vietnam, free from foreign masters. For him, It wasn't theory, it was personal. His father had been stripped of his job by the French. His country was treated like a resource, not a nation. World War II cracked open Indochina's cage. When France fell to Germany in 1940, the Japanese moved in, using Vietnam as a staging ground. The French colonial government became a puppet, and suddenly 2 foreign flags flew. For ordinary Vietnamese, things got worse: famine, forced labor, brutal policing. But in the shadows, the Viet Minh rose. Ho Chi Minh and his comrades built networks, fought small battles, and spread propaganda. They were fighting not just for communism, but for freedom. In August 1945, with Japan defeated and France weakened, Ho declared independence in Hanoi. His speech quoted the American Declaration of Independence. Imagine that, using Thomas Jefferson's words to tell the French to leave. But independence was short-lived. The French came back. And so the First Indochina War began, a brutal conflict of ambushes, sieges, and determination. Villagers carried supplies on foot, often at night. The Viet Minh dug tunnels, blended into the countryside. It wasn't about technology, it was about will. By 1954, the world watched a fortress called Dien Bien Phu fall to men with little more than rifles and shovels. France had lost, but Vietnam was still divided, north and south, communism and anti-communism. And waiting in the wings? The United States. This is the groundwork. By the time the U.S. even thought about Vietnam, the country was already a story of defiance, adaptation, and identity. For anyone marching into that green ribbon of land, the war had already started 1,000 years before. When the world cracked open in 1939, Vietnam was just another colony on France's list. But war has a funny way of rearranging the chessboard. A European war meant a chance and a risk for a small country halfway across the globe. For the Vietnamese, it was like watching their landlord suddenly stumble while a new, more aggressive one came knocking. The question was, would they seize the moment or be crushed between 2 empires? In June 1940, Nazi tanks rolled into Paris. France, the proud colonial master, collapsed in weeks. That shock rippled all the way to Indochina. When your parent country is occupied, your colony becomes fair game. Japan, expanding its own empire across Asia, saw an opening. They wanted resources: rice, rubber, minerals, and Indochina was a ripe pantry. So, under the banner of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japanese troops moved in. At first, it wasn't a full takeover. They let the French colonial administration, now loyal to Vichy France, stay in place, but only because it was convenient. Think of it as a landlord who still collects rent, but a new enforcer standing over their shoulder. This created a strange double occupation: French officials in their villas, Japanese soldiers in the streets. 2 flags, 2 foreign powers, neither Vietnamese. And for ordinary people, it meant tighter controls, heavier taxes, and food shortages. The Japanese siphoned off rice to feed their army. The French kept order but answered to Tokyo. By 1945, famine stalked the countryside. Estimates suggest as many as 2 million Vietnamese starved. Imagine the Mekong Delta, once a breadbasket, turning into a place where families boiled roots and weeds to survive. That suffering left a scar, and people remembered who was responsible. When power wobbles, the bold step in. Ho Chi Minh and his circle of nationalists saw the writing on the wall. Ho had been abroad: France, China, even the U.S., studying, organizing, watching. By the late 1930s, he returned to Asia, determined to use communism not just as an ideology, but as a tool of liberation. Under Japanese eyes, he founded the Viet Minh, League for the Independence of Vietnam, in 1941. Here's the genius: the Viet Minh wasn't pitched as purely communist. It was nationalist, inclusive, and framed around one simple idea: kick out the foreigners. Ho understood that peasants didn't care about marks, they cared about feeding their kids. So the Viet Minh helped villagers with crops, provided basic education, punished corrupt officials, and built loyalty the slow way. They also learned from history. Guerrilla tactics weren't new here. The hills and jungles had long sheltered rebels. But now rifles and radios were coming into play, and the Viet Minh were quick learners. It wasn't easy. Japanese police hunted them. French forces raided villages. Leaders were captured, tortured, executed. But the Viet Minh grew anyway. They moved through the hills of northern Vietnam, using caves and bamboo huts as headquarters. They worked closely with Chinese communists across the border. They even reached out to the Allies, offering intelligence against the Japanese. Imagine that, while America was fighting in the Pacific, some of its OSS, precursor to the CIA, agents were meeting Viet Minh fighters, dropping them weapons, and praising their courage. By 1944, Japan's war was turning sour. The Allies were pushing back. The U.S. was bombing Japanese cities. The Pacific was closing in. In March 1945, sensing French weakness, Japan swept away the pretense and took full control. Overnight, they disarmed French forces and set up a puppet regime in Vietnam. For the first time in decades, the French were out of the picture, but it wasn't liberation. It was just a new jailer. But the timing was terrible for Japan. Within months, 2 atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered. Suddenly, the Japanese were gone, the French were scattered, and a void opened. Vietnam, for the first time in generations, was unoccupied, but only for a heartbeat. In that heartbeat, Ho Chi Minh made his move. August 1945. The Japanese surrender created chaos. Local uprisings erupted. The Viet Minh swept into towns, taking over offices, seizing weapons. In Hanoi, crowds gathered in Ba Dinh Square to hear a thin, bearded man read a declaration. Ho Chi Minh's voice carried, "All men are created equal." Yes, those were Thomas Jefferson's words, spoken in the heart of Asia. Ho was savvy. He knew quoting America's founding ideals could appeal to the Allies. But this wasn't mimicry, it was a claim. Vietnam deserved to stand on its own. For a few brief weeks, it seemed possible. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed. Flags with gold stars flew. Farmers cheered. Students wrote slogans. Even some American officers nodded approval. But history rarely gives clean victories. When wars end, spoils are divided. The Allies decided Southeast Asia couldn't be left to chaos. British troops entered from the south to accept Japanese surrenders. Chinese nationalist troops came in from the north. And behind them, quietly, the French were already planning a comeback. By late 1945, French ships arrived in Saigon. Clashes began almost immediately. The Viet Minh knew what was coming, another war. This moment matters because it planted seeds of mistrust. The Vietnamese saw the Allies not as liberators, but as another set of occupiers. The brief taste of independence made the return of colonial rule even more bitter. Ho and his comrades had tasted the crowd's roar. They wouldn't give it up easily. World War II was more than a backdrop. It was the storm that cracked open the colonial system. Japan's occupation weakened France, but it also taught the Vietnamese valuable lessons. Organize locally, fight from the shadows, make friends with whoever gives you a gun. It was during these years that the Viet Minh learned to fight, and the idea of an independent Vietnam became something real, not just whispered. By 1946, the stage was set. The French were back, determined to reclaim their colony. The Viet Minh were ready, hardened, and armed. And far away, in Washington and Moscow, eyes were turning to Asia. The global Cold War was about to collide with a small country that refused to bow. By 1946, Vietnam had already declared its independence, but independence declared is not independence secured. The French were humiliated but not finished, and the world was still untangling itself from World War II. Into that mix came a clash that would turn Vietnam into a proving ground for guerrilla warfare, nationalist dreams, and colonial stubbornness. It's often overlooked, but the First Indochina War was where the script for the later American War was written, complete with jungle ambushes, political blindness, and a people who refused to quit. When Japan surrendered in 1945, there was chaos in Vietnam. British and Chinese forces moved in to disarm Japanese troops, but the French made it clear they wanted their colony back. They underestimated what had changed. Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh had tasted real power. In Hanoi, The Viet Minh were already running things: courts, schools, even postal services. Villagers weren't just obeying orders, they were singing nationalist songs and painting stars on flags. But France believed the world would let it resume its colonial role. After all, they were on the winning side, weren't they? By late 1945, French forces returned, first in the south, then north. It started small: skirmishes, protests, political talks. Ho even signed agreements with France hoping for a compromise, autonomy within a French union. But trust was paper-thin. Colonial pride met nationalist resolve, and soon Saigon exploded into violence. The breaking point came in December 1946. The French bombarded Haiphong, killing thousands, then moved on to Hanoi. It was war. Ho retreated to the jungle, famously telling his followers, "We would rather sacrifice everything than lose our country and return to slavery." The First Indochina War had begun. From the start, this wasn't an equal fight. France had tanks, planes, artillery, and professional soldiers, many hardened by World War II. They also had help: the Foreign Legion, North African troops, and colonial forces from across their empire. On paper, it looked like an easy win. The Viet Minh, by contrast, were poorly equipped. Many fought with old Japanese rifles, homemade grenades, or even spears. But they had two advantages: the will of the people and the terrain. Vietnam's jungles, hills, and rice paddies became weapons. The Viet Minh melted into the countryside. They struck supply lines, ambushed patrols, and disappeared. They dug tunnels and moved at night. A French convoy could travel 100 miles without seeing an enemy, then lose half its men to an attack from nowhere. It wasn't just tactics. It was politics. The Viet Minh promised land reform, literacy, and dignity. For peasants, this mattered. The French, meanwhile, were still landlords. The war became more than bullets. It was about whose vision of Vietnam would win hearts. By 1949, the war changed again. In China, Mao Zedong's communists won. Suddenly, the Viet Minh had a powerful friend on their northern border. They received weapons, advisors, and safe havens. The Cold War had arrived in Asia, and now Vietnam wasn't just a colonial rebellion, it was part of a bigger ideological struggle. The French responded by creating the State of Vietnam, installing former Emperor Bao Dai as head. It was meant to show that Vietnam could be free and French at the same time. But to many, Bao Dai seemed distant, more at home in casinos than rice fields. The Viet Minh's propaganda machine had an easy target: they painted him as a puppet. The U.S. also began to take notice. At first, American support was cautious: money, equipment, political sympathy. The Truman administration saw communism spreading and didn't want another domino to fall. But America wasn't ready to send troops yet. For now, this was still France's fight. This war wasn't fought in neat battle lines. It was villages caught between two forces. By day, the French might occupy a town. By night, the Viet Minh would slip back. Families were torn, sons joining the resistance, fathers working the fields, mothers feeding whoever came hungry. The French launched large sweeps, but the enemy often vanished like smoke. Soldiers remember it as a war of mud and sweat. Malaria, leeches, and rain were constant enemies. Equipment rusted. Morale was brittle. For every captured Viet Minh, another seemed to appear. The French Foreign Legion, famous for toughness, lost thousands. Still, they kept building forts, roads, and plans for a final blow. By 1953, France needed a win. The war was draining coffers and patience back home. A young French commander, Henri Navarre, thought he had a strategy: lure the Viet Minh into a decisive battle. He chose a remote valley in the northwest, Dien Bien Phu. There, the French built a fortress with airstrips, bunkers, and heavy guns. The idea was to cut Viet Minh supply lines into Laos and force them into open battle where French firepower could dominate. It seemed logical, but it underestimated one thing: the Viet Minh's determination. Under the brilliant General Vong Nguyen Giap, tens of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers dragged artillery through jungles and mountains, by hand, bicycle, even on backs. They surrounded Dien Bien Phu like a tightening noose. From March to May 1954, the valley became a cauldron. French positions were pounded day and night. Trenches closed in, parachute drops brought men into a losing fight. The world watched as the once proud French army was trapped. On May 7, 1954, the fortress fell. Thousands were captured. It was a humiliation, a signal that an Asian colonial war could defeat a Western power. Dien Bien Phu broke France's will. That summer, world leaders met in Geneva to decide Vietnam's future. The result was a compromise with consequences that would echo for decades. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. The North went to Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic. The South remained under Bao Dai, soon to be replaced by Ngo Dinh Diem. Elections were promised for 1956 to reunite the country. They never happened. The United States, increasingly wary of communist victories, supported the South. Ho Chi Minh prepared for the long game. And for Vietnam, the war was not over, it had only changed its name. Dien Bien Phu's thunder hadn't even faded before the world tried to make sense of what had just happened. A Western colonial power had been beaten by a nationalist, largely peasant army. Newspapers called it stunning, politicians called it troubling. And yet, for the Vietnamese who had fought so long, Dien Bien Phu wasn't the end. It was a pause. The next act would be written not on the battlefield, but around polished tables in Geneva, Switzerland. There, in 1954, the fate of Vietnam, and arguably the next 20 years of Southeast Asian history, was set in motion. Imagine the scene. Diplomats from the world's big powers, men in suits and uniforms, meeting under chandeliers, trying to decide the future of countries far away. At the table sat France, exhausted and humiliated, the United States, watching closely but not officially negotiating, the Soviet Union and China, confident but cautious, Britain, balancing interests. And there was Vietnam, or at least parts of it. The Viet Minh were represented, but only partially. Ho Chi Minh himself didn't attend. Instead, his foreign minister Pham Van Dong carried the cause. The South was represented by the state of Vietnam, still under Bao Dai. Two visions, one table, and a lot of hands in the game. The French wanted out, but with dignity. The Viet Minh wanted recognition and reunification. The Americans were wary of communism spreading. The Chinese and Soviets wanted to support their ally, but also avoid a larger war. It was a complicated dance. For the Vietnamese, it was a moment both thrilling and frustrating. They had bled for independence, but here their fate was being decided in another country by powers who didn't know their paddies or their villages. The outcome was something no Vietnamese nationalist truly wanted: a divided country. The Geneva Accords drew a line at the 17th parallel, creating a temporary boundary. North of that line, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh would control the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with its capital in Hanoi. South of the line, the state of Vietnam, soon to be led by Ngo Dinh Diem, would hold sway from Saigon. The agreement was supposed to be temporary. It called for nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country. But history has a way of turning temporary into permanent. The language was vague and trust was already thin. The Viet Minh believed the elections would bring them victory. They had grassroots support and a powerful story. But the South, with American backing, feared those very things. They saw the North not just as nationalists, but as communists, a red wave that could spill beyond Vietnam. To many Vietnamese, this division was heartbreaking. Families were split overnight. A fisherman in the Central Coast might have one son in the South, another in the North. Travelers suddenly needed papers. Villages found themselves caught between new authorities. The river didn't care about politics, but now it marked a border. The bamboo hedges that once meant home now stood in contested land. In the South, the French-installed Emperor Bao Dai was more figurehead than leader. The real rising power was Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist with little taste for colonial masters and a deep suspicion of communists. Washington liked him. He was anti-communist, disciplined, and could present a cleaner image than the French. By 1955, Bao Dai was ousted through a referendum, rigged by most accounts, and Diem declared the Republic of Vietnam, with himself as president. Diem's regime was strange to many South Vietnamese. He was austere, devout, and insulated. His government leaned heavily on family ties and loyalists. Catholics, though a minority, found favor, while the Buddhist majority sometimes felt sidelined. For rural peasants, Diem's government was distant. For city elites, he was stiff. But to the U.S., he was our man in Saigon. Aid began to flow: money, weapons, advisors. It was a marriage of convenience, with Washington hoping Diem could hold the line. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh's government moved quickly to consolidate. Land reforms swept through the countryside, sometimes harshly, sometimes brutally. Large landowners were stripped of holdings. Peasants were encouraged to denounce old landlords. Mistakes were made, some reforms turned bloody. But the North was determined to mold a socialist society, tighten control, and prepare for the long struggle ahead. Factories, though few, were nationalized. Schools emphasized literacy and ideology. Roads were repaired, villages reorganized, and the army kept drilling. The North also kept its networks alive in the South, quietly supporting communist cadres who stayed behind. It was like planting seeds that would sprout later, when the time was right. The Geneva Division didn't happen in a vacuum. The Cold War loomed large. Washington's domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, others would follow, made Vietnam suddenly more than a local problem. China and the Soviet Union saw an ally in Hanoi. America saw a potential red tide. The border at the 17th parallel became more than a line. It became a fault line between worlds. This meant Vietnam's future was now bound to the moods and fears of superpowers. It wasn't just a nationalist struggle anymore, it was part of a global chess game. And the pawns? Villagers in the Mekong, fishermen on the coast, kids learning new anthems. The Geneva Accords were supposed to prevent more bloodshed. Instead, they planted the seeds for a bigger war. Neither side truly believed the other would honor the deal. Neither trusted the promise of free elections. And so, the divide hardened. The North prepared, confident that time and politics were on its side. The South fortified, convinced it was the last domino standing. For ordinary Vietnamese, life became a balancing act. Farmers still grew rice, markets still bustled, but whispers traveled faster. Whose side are you on? The bamboo hedges that once offered shade now hid fears. The world may remember the American War, but here, in 1954, the stage was already set. Two flags now flew over one people. A promise of elections would fade. And somewhere in the distance, the first American advisors were already packing their bags. When the ink dried on the Geneva Accords in 1954, Vietnam was sliced in half like a piece of bamboo split down the middle. It wasn't supposed to stay that way. The line at the 17th parallel was meant to be temporary, a pause button before national elections that would reunite the country. But pauses sometimes turn into full stops, and in this case, the split hardened almost immediately. What emerged were two Vietnams, same language, same history, but very different dreams. In the North, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam was quick to consolidate power. They called it liberation. Their opponents called it communism. Either way, Hanoi became the heart of a one-party state, disciplined and determined. Ho was more than a leader, he was a symbol, a father figure with a long beard and simple clothes, often seen mingling with peasants. Behind the scenes, though, power was concentrated in the hands of the Communist Party, with Vong Nguyen Giap, Truong Chin, and Pham Van Dong shaping policies. Their mission? Transform a war-torn, mostly rural society into a socialist state. Land reforms targeted big landlords, redistributing land to peasants. Some of these campaigns turned harsh executions, public denunciations, and social upheaval shook the countryside. Still, for many peasants, this was the first time they felt ownership of their fields. Schools emphasized literacy and ideology. Songs praised the revolution. Radios carried Ho's words. The North was poor but proud, preparing for a long game. Meanwhile, the South was a different story. The French, beaten at Dien Bien Phu, faded away. but in their place stepped the Americans. They needed someone to rally the South against communism, and they found him in No Din Diem. Diem was Catholic, nationalist, and fiercely anti-communist. By 1955, after a manipulated referendum pushed out the last Emperor Bao Dai, Diem declared the Republic of Vietnam with himself as president. Saigon became its capital, a city of colonial boulevards and neon ambitions. Diem faced a tough job. The South wasn't united, it was a patchwork of Catholics, Buddhists, ethnic minorities, and powerful regional groups. The army was still finding its footing, and rural areas were dotted with communist sympathizers left behind after Geneva. But Diem moved fast. He centralized power, sidelined rivals, and leaned on family. His brothers held key posts. His sister-in-law became a controversial political voice. To Washington, Diem looked like a godsend, disciplined, anti-communist, and a local face to counter Ho Chi Minh. Aid poured in: advisors, money, weapons, even helicopters. American officials praised his determination, calling him the miracle man of Asia. But to many Vietnamese, he was distant, rigid, and sometimes tone-deaf. He favored Catholics in a Buddhist-majority land. He distrusted local militias and crushed religious sects that challenged his authority. The rural peasants, who made up the majority, often felt neglected. Land reform in the South was weak compared to the North. Many farmers still paid rent to absentee landlords. While Diem built highways and schools, the countryside remained restless. Geneva's plan had called for nationwide elections in 1956. The idea was simple: let the Vietnamese choose their future. But here's the uncomfortable truth: everyone knew who would win. Ho Chi Minh was a hero to millions, especially in the South, where Diem's government was new and fragile. The North was organized and disciplined. The South was still finding its feet. The U.S. and Diem saw the writing on the wall. They argued that free elections were impossible in a communist state, that the North wouldn't play fair. Behind those arguments was fear. A vote could hand all of Vietnam to Ho without a shot fired. So Diem refused to hold elections. Washington backed him. For Ho, this was betrayal. For villagers who dreamed of reunification, it was disappointment. The line at the 17th parallel hardened. Families stayed divided. And in the South, communist cadres who had been told to wait now felt abandoned. Quietly, many slipped back into the underground. The seeds of the next war were already sprouting. What did this split look like for ordinary people? For some, not much changed. Rice still had to be planted, markets still bustled. But whispers grew louder. In the North, meetings were held in village squares to redistribute land. Some landlords were humiliated, others fled. In the South, government officials arrived in jeeps, collecting taxes and demanding loyalty. Posters went up praising Diem, pamphlets went up praising Ho. Families were caught between loyalties. Letters between North and South were censored. Some chose to move. Nearly 1 million people, mostly Catholics, left the North for the South, encouraged by U.S. ships and propaganda. At the same time, Viet Minh cadres melted into hamlets, hiding weapons in bamboo groves, waiting for a signal that the fight wasn't over. By the late 1950s, the world wasn't just watching Vietnam, it was leaning on it. For Washington, Saigon was a front line against communism, a domino they couldn't afford to lose. For Beijing and Moscow, Hanoi was proof that colonialism could be beaten, a bright spot in a global struggle. Both sides sent aid, advisors, and propaganda. Vietnamese politics were suddenly global. Radio Hanoi broadcast Marx and Lenin. Radio Saigon played American music and boasted of development. The 17th parallel became more than a border, it was a symbol of the Cold War, a thin line carrying the weight of two competing worlds. The birth of two Vietnams wasn't just a political accident, it was a collision of history, ideology, and foreign interest. The North hardened into a disciplined, revolutionary state. The South tried to become modern, Western-backed, but remained fragile. Each claimed legitimacy, each saw the other as a threat. The promise of peace at Geneva had turned into a countdown. The villages and cities were quiet for now, but below the surface, anger and hope mixed like dry tinder. And as always in Vietnam, the people were patient. Wars could wait, the land had seen many. But when they came hard. By the mid-1950s, the ink on the Geneva Accords was fading, but the consequences were only sharpening. Vietnam was now two countries, and while the French limped away licking their wounds, another power was watching closely. The United States, fresh from its victory in World War II and already locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, saw Asia as a chessboard. And on that board, Vietnam, thin, green, and divided, looked like a domino that could topple many others. To most Americans in the early 1950s, Vietnam wasn't a household name. Korea had just been a bloody surprise. Europe was the main focus. But to strategists in Washington, Asia was becoming the new front line. China had fallen to communism in 1949, Korea had nearly gone red in 1950, and Soviet influence seemed to be spreading like spilled ink. It was in this context that the domino theory emerged. President Dwight D. Eisenhower famously explained it: if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow: Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, maybe even India. And behind that fear was something deeper, the belief that the U.S. couldn't afford to seem weak after the Korean War. Containment wasn't just a policy, it was a promise to allies and a warning to adversaries. Vietnam, though small, became a symbol. Washington didn't want to send troops, not yet, but it wanted to shore up the South, keep it stable, and prove that free nations could resist communism. And so, America stepped quietly but firmly into a land it barely understood. In the South, No Din Diem was trying to turn a patchwork country into a functioning state. He was America's man, not because he was warm and popular, but because he was fiercely anti-communist and willing to resist both the North and internal rivals. U.S. officials admired his discipline and Catholic piety. They called him the Miracle Man. But there was a problem. Diem didn't govern like a Democrat. He trusted his family, sidelined opponents, and often ignored advice. Still, Washington doubled down. Billions in aid flowed, money for infrastructure, weapons for the army, training programs for civil servants. American military advisors arrived in increasing numbers, teaching South Vietnamese soldiers how to use radios, rifles, and helicopters. Civil programs built roads, schools, and clinics. But underneath the shiny projects, cracks showed. Diem's government often failed to connect with the rural poor. Land reform stalled. Corruption whispered through offices. To peasants in the Mekong Delta, the talk of freedom sometimes felt distant. And to the communists hiding in the countryside, the Viet Cong, as they'd soon be called, it was an opportunity. The South was busy building a capital city. They were busy building networks. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh and his government in Hanoi played a long game. They had accepted the Geneva Division, but they never believed it was permanent. The elections that were supposed to reunify the country had been canceled. To them, the South was a lost province waiting to come home. Hanoi rebuilt after the war. They tightened control, trained cadres, and quietly sent people south to organize. They didn't launch open war, not yet. Instead, they stirred the pot: political agitation, propaganda, assassinations of village chiefs loyal to Diem. They tested the limits while keeping their hands mostly hidden. The North also leaned on friends. China sent supplies, the Soviet Union sent technical aid. For a country that was poor and rural, these alliances mattered. Hanoi's leaders knew they couldn't match American wealth, but they could outlast American patience. History had taught them that outsiders eventually left. In these years, Vietnam became a shadow game. The CIA worked quietly, sometimes clumsily, to support Diem. Advisors in crisp uniforms arrived, but the countryside was still misty with rumors and loyalty to local networks. Washington liked big plans. Vietnam was made of small places, hamlets, paddies, paths that didn't show up on maps. American officials often underestimated the complexity of Vietnamese society. They saw communism as one big monolith, but for many in the South, Loyalty wasn't to ideology, but to family, village, or religion. The Viet Minh veterans in the South weren't all ideologues, they were neighbors with long memories. And when an outsider's jeep rolled through a village, it often stirred suspicion as much as admiration. Why did the U.S. keep investing in a faraway land? Some of it was pure geopolitics, contain communism, keep credibility. Some of it was pride. After France's failure, Washington didn't want to seem timid. There was also a genuine, if sometimes naive, belief that America could help. Many advisors thought they were building a democracy, defending a small country from aggression. But there were blind spots. Few spoke Vietnamese. Few understood the layers of history. Few realized that the conflict wasn't just about capitalism versus communism. It was about independence, pride, and a people who had fought outsiders for centuries. By the late 1950s, the U.S. presence was growing quietly but steadily. There were no massive troop landings yet, but the seeds were being planted: bases, training centers, more advisors, more aid. And in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh watched, patient as ever. The 17th parallel was now more than a line, it was a wound. Letters were censored, families separated, spies moved like shadows. Diem tightened his grip, the North prepared underground movements. And somewhere in the jungles, young men were choosing sides, some for ideology, some for revenge, some simply because it was the only path offered. The world barely noticed. Washington was busy with Sputnik, Khrushchev, and Cuba. Saigon was a postcard of boulevards and parades. But in the villages, there was a hum of tension. Something was building, slow but certain. It wouldn't be long before the advisors brought more than advice, and Vietnam would become not just a line on a map, but a headline on every American breakfast table. When John F. Kennedy took the oath of office in January 1961, he inherited more than a young man's ambition and a Cold War already running hot. He inherited a simmering problem in a narrow strip of land most Americans still couldn't find on a map. Vietnam was no longer just France's failed colony or Eisenhower's quiet experiment. It was now a test for a new president who believed America could meet any challenge if it acted boldly. Kennedy's world was jittery. The Soviets had launched Sputnik. Fidel Castro had taken Cuba. Khrushchev was pounding shoes at the UN. The Cold War felt like a game of chicken on a global highway. Kennedy's advisors believed communism was a tide. If you didn't block it, it would spread. And in Southeast Asia, the first sandbags were piled in Vietnam. The domino theory still guided policy, and Vietnam was one of those dominoes. JFK wasn't ready to send combat troops. He didn't want another Korea. But he believed the U.S. could help South Vietnam help itself. He talked about paying any price, bearing any burden, and Vietnam, small as it was, seemed a place to prove it. In Saigon, Ngo Dinh Diem was still president, still austere, still leaning heavily on his family. To Washington, Diem was frustrating. He was anti-communist, yes, but also stubborn and suspicious. He resisted reforms, clamped down on opposition, and seemed out of touch with his own peasants. But Kennedy and his advisors felt they had no better option. Diem was the man in charge, and losing him could mean chaos. So the U.S. doubled down again. Advisors multiplied. Helicopters whirred into South Vietnam, flown by American pilots, but painted with South Vietnamese markings. Kennedy approved more money, more training, and even allowed U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets, to help South Vietnamese troops with counterinsurgency. The idea was clear: strengthen Diem, modernize the army, and crush communist infiltration before it became a wildfire. But there was one thing America didn't fully see: the fire had already started. While Saigon debated and Washington planned, the North moved quietly. By 1959, Hanoi had approved armed struggle in the South. Cadres who had stayed hidden since Geneva emerged from rice paddies and rubber plantations, organizing guerrilla bands. They called themselves the National Liberation Front, NLF, but the world knew them by another name: the Viet Cong. They weren't a conventional army. They were farmers by day, fighters by night. They assassinated village chiefs, ambushed convoys, and built shadow governments in rural areas. For many villagers, The Viet Cong were neighbors and cousins. They moved along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a growing network of paths and roads through Laos and Cambodia, carrying weapons and men south. By 1961, the Viet Cong were attacking outposts, cutting roads, and spreading fear. Diem's government called them terrorists. Hanoi called them liberators. Either way, they were winning ground, not by seizing big cities, but by slowly pulling the countryside away from Saigon's grasp. Kennedy was fascinated by the idea of counterinsurgency, small teams, clever tactics, and local partnerships. He believed America could teach the South Vietnamese to fight a smarter war. So the U.S. sent experts in unconventional warfare, built training centers, and supplied helicopters to move troops quickly across difficult terrain. Programs like the strategic hamlet concept were born. Villagers were relocated into fortified communities to isolate them from the Viet Cong. On paper, it sounded like a neat solution: cut off the insurgents from their base of support. In reality, it was often clumsy. Moving families angered them. Poor planning left hamlets vulnerable. Sometimes, the Viet Cong just melted away and came back later, stronger. American advisors learned fast that Vietnam was not just a battlefield, it was a political puzzle. Winning hearts and minds mattered as much as winning firefights. Yet the focus often drifted to numbers. How many rifles distributed? How many patrols launched? Washington wanted metrics. Vietnam was giving them mysteries. Kennedy's efforts were not without flashes of success. Some South Vietnamese units became more capable, some villages safer. The U.S. presence grew to about 16,000 advisors by 1963. Helicopters became symbols of speed and power. But problems multiplied too. Diem's authoritarian streak deepened. Corruption sapped morale. Buddhist monks, feeling marginalized in a Catholic-dominated government, began protesting. In 1963, those protests erupted into a crisis. One monk, Thich Quang Duc, sat down at a busy Saigon intersection, doused himself in gasoline, and lit a match. The photograph of his calm, burning body went around the world. It was a shock to Americans, a glimpse that something was deeply wrong in their allies' house. The U.S. began to doubt Diem. Kennedy's team debated, could they support him? Could they replace him? In November 1963, South Vietnamese generals, with U.S. approval tacitly in the background, staged a coup. Diem and his brother were captured and killed. Kennedy didn't live to see the fallout. 3 weeks later, he was shot in Dallas. The torch passed to Lyndon V. Johnson, a man with a different style and an appetite for action. Kennedy didn't start the Vietnam War, but he nudged it forward. He sent advisors, money, helicopters, and special forces. He believed America could help a struggling friend, but he underestimated the complexity of Vietnamese politics and the depth of local loyalties. By the time he left the scene, the U.S. was far more entangled than it had been. The North was more aggressive, the South was unstable. And in the shadows, the Viet Cong were growing bolder. The stage was now set for escalation. The next president would not just advise. He would send the Marines. When the average American in the early 1960s thought of Vietnam, they pictured rice paddies and jungle skirmishes, not monks on fire. Yet in 1963, that's exactly what the world saw: saffron-robed Buddhist monks kneeling calmly in city streets, chanting as flames engulfed them. For Washington, this was confusing and embarrassing. For South Vietnam, it was a sign of deep cracks in the house that No Dinh Diem had built. To understand the crisis, you have to understand Diem. He was a devout Catholic in a land where most people were Buddhist. That wasn't automatically a problem. Vietnam had a long tradition of religious tolerance, but Diem's regime tilted heavily toward Catholics. His family members held key posts. Catholic villages often received better land and aid, and Buddhist ceremonies were sometimes restricted. By 1963, these tensions were simmering. Then came May 8th in the city of Hue. Buddhists gathered to celebrate Vesak, the Buddha's birthday. They flew religious flags, a normal practice. But Diem's government, citing a ban on religious flags, ordered them down. Catholics had been allowed to fly Vatican flags just days earlier, so the crackdown stung. Protesters gathered. Police and troops opened fire. Several were killed, including children. The images spread fast. What started as a local protest became a movement. Buddhists demanded religious equality, an end to discrimination, and respect for their traditions. Diem called them political agitators. His sister-in-law, Madame Nu, famously sneered, calling the self-immolations barbecues. That single remark would haunt her and Diem's government. The protests escalated. Monks marched, students joined, and pagodas became centers of resistance. And then, on June 11, 1963, in Saigon, something happened that no one could ignore. Thich Quang Duc, an elderly monk, sat calmly at an intersection, poured gasoline over his head, and struck a match. The photograph captured by Malcolm Brown made headlines worldwide. There was no scream, no panic, just stillness in the flames. To many, it symbolized quiet despair, to others, unshakable conviction. Either way, it stunned Washington. Kennedy saw the photo and reportedly said, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world." America was backing a government whose citizens were setting themselves on fire. Even loyal Diem supporters found it hard to explain. More protests followed. Monks were beaten. Pagodas were raided. Diem's government declared martial law and arrested thousands of Buddhists. Instead of restoring order, it deepened the divide. South Vietnam was fighting a war in the countryside, but now its cities were boiling too. For years, the U.S. had supported Diem as a bulwark against communism. But 1963 made Washington doubt. Diem's stubbornness, his family's arrogance, and his inability to read the mood were becoming liabilities. Inside the U.S. Embassy and the White House, debates raged. Could Diem reform? Could his family be persuaded to step back? Could a new leader do better? Kennedy was reluctant to topple an ally, but the Buddhist crisis made inaction look like complicity. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong were watching with interest. Every protest, every bullet fired at monks weakened Saigon's legitimacy. It wasn't the communists who were discrediting Diem, it was Diem himself. By the fall of 1963, South Vietnam's own generals were restless. Many were tired of Diem's favoritism, frustrated by his inner circle, and alarmed by the growing unrest. Quiet conversations began with American officials. In Washington, there was no single order to overthrow Diem, but there was a signal, a tacit green light. The Kennedy administration made it clear they would not intervene if a change occurred. Some officials even encouraged it. On November 1, 1963, tanks rolled into Saigon. Radio stations crackled. Diem's forces fought back but were outnumbered. By nightfall, the regime was collapsing. Diem and his brother, No Dinh Nu, fled the palace, taking refuge in a church. They were captured the next morning. Hours later, they were dead, shot in the back of an armored vehicle. The coup was swift, but it sent shockwaves. South Vietnam cheered, mourned, and worried all at once. America's ally was gone, and in his place stood a military junta unsure of its own strength. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. The two deaths, so close together, changed everything. Vietnam was suddenly without its first strongman, and America was about to get a new president with a very different style, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The Buddhist crisis and Diem's fall revealed the fragility of South Vietnam's political core. The war against the Viet Cong was tough enough, but Diem's alienation of his own people made it harder. His failure to bridge religious divides turned potential allies into critics. For the U.S., it was a wake-up call. They weren't just fighting communists, they were tied to a government that could implode from within. The coup seemed like a fresh start, but in reality, it unleashed a cycle of instability. South Vietnam would go through leaders like revolving doors, each promising stability, few delivering it. The enemy in the jungle was still out there, but now the political jungle in Saigon was just as dangerous. On November 22, 1963, America lost a young president in Dallas. Within hours, Lyndon Baines Johnson was taking the oath of office aboard Air Force One, hand raised beside a grief-stricken Jackie Kennedy. Johnson was a seasoned politician, not a man given to illusions. He understood power, persuasion, and pressure better than most. What he didn't fully grasp, at least not yet, was the mess waiting for him in a country halfway around the world called Vietnam. Johnson didn't come to office with a fresh slate. He came with Kennedy's unfinished business. And in Southeast Asia, that meant a divided Vietnam, a growing insurgency, and a shaky ally in Saigon. Diem was gone, assassinated in a coup just 3 weeks before JFK's death. His fall had left South Vietnam politically adrift, run by a military junta that couldn't even decide how to govern, let alone fight a war. For Johnson, Vietnam wasn't just a foreign policy problem, it was a political trap. He was a domestic man at heart, dreaming of the Great Society, civil rights, poverty programs, Medicare. But he knew that looking weak on communism could destroy those dreams. The ghosts of who lost China still haunted Washington. Johnson feared becoming the president who lost Vietnam. So his instinct was clear: don't let it fall. The question was how. By early 1964, South Vietnam was a house with no foundation. After Diem's death, generals jostled for power like roosters in a yard. Coup followed coup. In January, General Nguyen Khan seized control, another new name for Americans to learn, another leader to prop up. Each promised stability, none delivered it. Meanwhile, the countryside was slipping away. The Viet Cong grew bolder, ambushing convoys, overrunning outposts, and assassinating village officials. By night, they controlled swathes of rural land. By day, Saigon boasted of progress in government reports. It was smoke and mirrors, and Washington knew it. For villagers, life was perilous. Government troops demanded loyalty. Guerrillas demanded rice. Pick the wrong side, and you could die. For U.S. advisors, the frustration was thick. Helicopters could move troops quickly, but you couldn't airlift political legitimacy. LBJ wasn't eager for war, at least not at first. He knew Americans were weary after Korea. He also knew elections were coming in 1964. "I don't want to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went," he told aides. But he also said, "I don't want to start another damn war." So Johnson walked a tightrope: stand firm without escalating too far. U.S. advisors kept increasing. 16,000 became 23,000. More helicopters arrived. Aid poured in. But these weren't combat troops, at least not officially. Johnson stuck with Kennedy's playbook: train, advise, support. Behind the scenes, though, the pressure was mounting. The Pentagon urged stronger measures. Hawks in Congress warned of disaster if South Vietnam collapsed. Doves whispered doubts. Was this worth American blood? And then, in a dark corner of the Gulf of Tonkin, history threw Johnson a match. It started with patrols, South Vietnamese raids along North Vietnam's coast, supported by U.S. naval intelligence. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The ship fired back, planes strafed the attackers. No Americans died. 2 days later, another message crackled in: a second attack on U.S. ships in the same Gulf. This time, reports were murky: radar blips, confused signals, bad weather. Later evidence suggests the second attack never happened. But in Washington, ambiguity melted into urgency. Johnson seized the moment. He went on TV, calm and firm, telling Americans their forces had been attacked on the high seas. He asked Congress for authority to respond. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a blank check for war, passed with near unanimity. Johnson didn't declare war. He promised no wider conflict. He portrayed the response as limited, defensive. But the legal foundation was now laid. The resolution gave him power to take all necessary measures in Vietnam. Johnson had his mandate. The powder keg was primed. Why did Johnson lean in instead of stepping back? Partly fear that retreat would embolden communism everywhere, from Laos to Berlin. Partly politics: he was heading into an election against Barry Goldwater, who painted Democrats as soft on defense. And partly confidence: Johnson believed in American power. He thought, as many did, that more force could tip the scales. What no one grasped yet was the nature of the war. They saw it as a conventional contest, a matter of firepower and resolve. They underestimated the depth of Vietnamese nationalism, the skill of the Viet Cong, and the fragility of Saigon's politics. Johnson told aides, "It's like Grandma's nightshirt, it covers everything." He meant the resolution gave him legal room to maneuver. What he didn't say was that the nightshirt was about to get soaked in blood. By the end of 1964, U.S. planes were already bombing North Vietnamese targets in retaliation for the Gulf of Tonkin. Advisors were increasingly in combat zones, even if Washington avoided the word combat. The Viet Cong were striking harder. The South was wobbling. Johnson won a landslide election in November, promising, "We seek no wider war." Privately, he prepared for one. Plans were drawn for more troops, more bombing, more pressure. The road to escalation was paved not with one dramatic decision, but with a series of small steps, each easier than the next. And so, as Christmas lights glowed in America, new orders crackled across the Pacific. The Marines were warming up. The air bases were expanding. The war everyone said they didn't want was moving closer. Sometimes history turns on a single spark. For America in Vietnam, that spark came from a gray stretch of water off a country most Americans still couldn't pronounce correctly. It was August 1964, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident gave President Lyndon Johnson something he had been trying to avoid, a reason to step further into the fight. Whether that reason was clear or clouded hardly mattered. Once the decision was made, the U.S. was on a path that would lead to full-scale war. By mid-1964, things in Vietnam were already tense. The Viet Cong were stepping up attacks in the south. Saigon's politics were chaotic, swinging between coups and counter-coups. The North was getting bolder, testing its limits with infiltration and support for the Southern insurgency. In Washington, Johnson's team debated how to show strength without looking like the aggressor. The U.S. Navy was running patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin, intelligence-gathering missions, partly to watch North Vietnam and partly to reassure the South. These weren't combat patrols on paper, but they were provocative. North Vietnam certainly saw them as hostile. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. destroyer, was cruising off the coast. It wasn't alone. South Vietnamese forces had been conducting covert raids nearby. To Hanoi, it looked like a pattern. That afternoon, 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats moved in. Maddox reported being approached aggressively. Warning shots were fired. The patrol boats fired back, torpedoes missed, machine guns rattled. The Maddox responded with its own guns and air cover from the carrier USS Ticonderoga. The exchange was brief. One patrol boat was damaged, another heavily hit. Maddox escaped unharmed. Washington reacted quickly but cautiously. Johnson ordered the Maddox to stay in the area, joined by another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. The message was clear: America would not be chased away. 2 days later, August 4th, reports came in of another attack. This time, in poor weather, the Maddox and Turner Joy detected what they thought were torpedoes, fast-moving boats, and enemy fire. Radio messages crackled. Sonar readings were confusing. The captains believed they were under attack, and they fired back. But here's the twist. Evidence for this second attack was, and still is, murky. Some historians believe there was no attack at all. Radar blips could have been weather. Sonar contacts could have been false. Johnson's own defense secretary, Robert McNamara, later admitted the details were uncertain. But at the time, in the fog of war and Cold War politics, certainty was a luxury no one had. What mattered wasn't the truth, it was the perception. 2 attacks sounded like aggression. For Johnson, already under pressure to look strong, it was enough. Within hours, Johnson went on national television. He described open aggression on the high seas and promised that America would respond. Behind the scenes, he ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases. It was a limited response, but it was a clear message. The U.S. was ready to hit back. More importantly, Johnson went to Congress. He asked for authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was a broad request. Congress gave it to him almost unanimously. Only Senators Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruening voted no. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed on August 7, 1964. It was short, vague, and powerful. Johnson now had what was essentially a blank check to escalate the war without a formal declaration. The resolution would become the legal backbone for nearly a decade of conflict. The Tonkin events gave Johnson something he wanted: freedom of action. But it also gave him something he hadn't planned on: momentum. Public opinion, at least initially, supported him. Few questioned the details. The Cold War lens made everything clear: if they attacked us, we hit back. But Hanoi read it differently. They saw a superpower willing to widen the war over a few shots fired at sea. They prepared for more air raids, more pressure, more American involvement. For the Viet Cong, it was proof that the U.S. was moving from advisor to combatant. And in Saigon, Tonkin didn't solve instability. Governments still changed, corruption still festered. But now there was something else. American Marines were on the horizon. Looking back, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is a lesson in speed, perception, and politics. Was there an attack? Yes, on August 2nd. Was there another? Maybe, maybe not. But the moment gave Johnson the authority to act, and once that authority was in hand, it was hard to stop. For Johnson, Tonkin was about more than ships. It was about credibility. He didn't want to be the president who lost Vietnam, who let another domino fall. In the charged atmosphere of the Cold War, caution looked like weakness. The irony is that Johnson still hoped to avoid a full war. His campaign that fall promised restraint. We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Yet by the spring of 1965, those same boys would be stepping onto Vietnamese soil. The Gulf of Tonkin was a hinge. Before it, America's role was big but limited: advisors, aid, some covert action. After it, America had legal cover to wage war. Congress, the press, and the public largely backed it. And Johnson, the politician who loved to count votes and build roads, now held the keys to a widening conflict. The sea fight lasted minutes. The consequences lasted years. By early 1965, the United States was done dipping its toes in Vietnamese waters. After the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, President Lyndon B. Johnson had the authority he needed to escalate, and the Viet Cong were giving him every excuse. They were attacking outposts, ambushing convoys, and even striking near Saigon. Then came February 1965. Viet Cong guerrillas assaulted a U.S. base at Pleiku, killing 8 Americans and wounding dozens. For Johnson, this was the spark that lit the fuse. The gloves were coming off. Johnson didn't want to be the president who lost Vietnam, especially not after Kennedy's ghost still loomed and critics were watching. He had spent his first year balancing his domestic ambitions, the Great Society, with a problem half a world away. But after Pleiku, Johnson told his team something clear: the United States had to show strength. The plan was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It wasn't a single strike. It was a campaign, a sustained bombing offensive against North Vietnam. The idea was simple: hit the North hard enough to make them rethink supporting the insurgency in the South. Bomb roads, bridges, supply lines, and bases. Disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that twisting lifeline through Laos and Cambodia. Show the world that America meant business. The first bombs fell on March 2, 1965. American pilots roared over the jungles and rice paddies, dropping explosives on targets from the DMZ all the way toward Hanoi. The sounds of jet engines, the flash of napalm, the craters in roads, it was shock and awe, 1960s style. For the pilots, it was dangerous work. North Vietnam wasn't defenseless. Soviet-made anti-aircraft guns were already waiting. Later, surface-to-air missiles would appear. Enemy pilots flew MiGs. Some American planes were shot down, some pilots were captured and paraded through Hanoi. But the strikes kept coming. For 3 long years, Rolling Thunder thundered, sometimes more, sometimes less, but always there. Between 1965 and 1968, the U.S. dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, more than in the entire Pacific campaign of World War II. Rolling thunder was meant to be pressure, not annihilation. Johnson was careful, too careful, some argued. He didn't want to provoke China or the Soviet Union into jumping into the war, like they had in Korea. So targets were often chosen carefully, sometimes debated endlessly in Washington. Johnson even personally approved some targets, down to bridges and power plants. This caution frustrated the military. Pilots risked their lives to hit roads that could be rebuilt overnight. Factories deep in Hanoi were often off limits. Meanwhile, the North kept moving supplies south, often by hand, bicycle, or hidden trails. For Johnson, the bombs weren't just about destroying things, they were about sending messages. To Hanoi, stop supporting the Viet Cong. To Saigon, we've got your back. To Americans, we're in control. But Vietnam was a country, not a message board, and messages were getting scrambled. At first, most Americans supported Johnson's moves. The memory of Korea and the Cold War kept people wary of communism. But as weeks turned into months, questions grew. Television brought images of flames and villages into living rooms. And in Vietnam itself, something unintended happened. The bombing hardened North Vietnam's resolve. Instead of folding, they dug deeper. Roads were rebuilt, sometimes overnight. Anti-aircraft gunners became heroes. And in the south, the Viet Cong used the attacks to recruit. Look, they told peasants, the Americans are bombing your brothers. Johnson had hoped rolling thunder would weaken the enemy. It often stiffened their spine instead. The air war was only half the story. In March 1965, even as the first bombs were falling, Johnson sent ground troops, not just advisors, but combat Marines to protect airbases and installations. Da Nang saw the first major U.S. landings. The Marines were greeted with smiles, flowers, and curiosity, but they were also stepping into a land already primed for war. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American troops were in Vietnam. What started as an advisory mission was becoming something else entirely. Rolling thunder had been meant to pressure, but instead, it was the prelude to an open-ended ground war. Rolling thunder was never just about bombs. It was about commitment. It marked the moment when the United States stopped pretending it was just helping and started fighting. It showed the world America's firepower, but it also showed something else, that even the strongest nation could find itself tangled in a war it didn't fully understand. For the North, the bombing campaign was a trial by fire, but it proved something important. They could take the hits and keep fighting. For the South, the arrival of American troops was a relief, but also a reminder of dependence. For Johnson, every bomb dropped was another political weight. The Great Society was competing with war spending. Critics began to murmur. Hawks wanted more, doves wanted out. And the Viet Cong? They kept coming night after night, through tunnels and trails, under the thunder above. Rolling thunder was supposed to end the fight quickly. Instead, it made the fight bigger. By 1966, the United States was no longer just a bystander in Vietnam, it was the main actor. Rolling thunder roared overhead, Marines were landing on beaches, and Army units were spreading through the jungles. But this wasn't a war of neat battle lines. It was a war of rotation, of young men pulled from classrooms and farms, of choppers beating the air like angry hornets. And at home, the draft was turning quiet discomfort into a national hum of tension. If you were an American boy in the mid-1960s, Vietnam wasn't some distant story. It could land in your mailbox. The Selective Service System, in place since World War II, was pulling names for a war half a world away. At first, the numbers were small. Then they grew. By 1966, hundreds of thousands were being drafted each year. Some went willingly, some reluctantly, some not at all. College deferments, medical excuses, and family connections sometimes spared the well-off. Working-class kids, especially minorities, were less lucky. For many, the draft was less about patriotism and more about luck and timing. This wasn't World War II. There was no clear Pearl Harbor, no Nazi threat. Vietnam was harder to explain, and many couldn't see why they should fight. Yet when your number came up, choices were limited: serve, flee, or fight the system. Canada quietly became a refuge. Anti-draft groups began organizing. But for most, the letter meant one thing: basic training, a haircut, a rifle, and a ticket to a humid country few could spell correctly. When those young men arrived, they found a war unlike anything their fathers had fought. Vietnam was a patchwork of rice paddies, hills, rivers, and thick jungle. Convoys moved slowly, roads were mined, ambushes were common. The solution? Take to the air. The UH-1 Iroquois, better known as the Huey, became the war's workhorse and its icon. Its thumping blades were the soundtrack of the conflict. It ferried troops, evacuated the wounded, carried supplies, and even delivered gunfire. Helicopters could drop soldiers into a clearing and lift them out hours later. They could chase fleeting enemies and retreat just as fast. For the American soldier, the Huey was lifeline and alarm bell. When you heard that beat overhead, it might mean reinforcements or a ride home, or a medevac for a friend. Many soldiers remembered the smell of fuel, the wind blast, the deafening noise. The Huey gave the Americans mobility, but it also revealed something else. The enemy wasn't waiting for open battles. They faded, regrouped, hit again. Unlike the Germans or Japanese of earlier wars, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army didn't mass in neat formations. They used tunnels, booby traps, and ambushes. Helicopters gave U.S. forces speed, but the enemy had patience. A landing zone could be quiet one moment, a killing ground the next. American troops often found themselves searching and destroying, going village to village, field to field, looking for an enemy that could be anyone or no one. It wore on nerves. It blurred friend and foe. Some villagers welcomed them, others feared them, some supported the guerrillas. For many young Americans, this was their first time away from home, and they were fighting not just heat and jungle, but an invisible foe who knew the land far better. The draft didn't just feed the war, it fed dissent. Parents worried. College campuses stirred. The images of helicopters lifting wounded men, body bags arriving at airfields, and casualty lists in newspapers started to feel personal. Some Americans supported the war, believing it was necessary to stop communism. Others questioned it, asking why their sons were dying in a country that seemed to be unraveling politically. By 1967, protests were growing, small at first, then louder. The draft became the lightning rod. Even among those who served, there was unease. Some believed in the mission, others felt trapped by it. Letters home were filled with heat, rain, leeches, and fear, and sometimes pride, sometimes bitterness. The draft made Vietnam every American family's business. Helicopters made the war fast and flexible, but also highlighted its chaos. Soldiers weren't fighting for territory. They were fighting time, trying to wear down an enemy that could vanish. The Huey's shadow stretched far beyond battlefields. It became a symbol of rescue and loss, of technology clashing with patience. And the draft made the war less abstract. Every headline could mean someone's brother or son. As 1967 turned into 1968, those helicopters would carry men into battles that shocked the world. And the protests, fueled by the draft, would soon roar as loud as any rotor blade. Ask any veteran what they remember first about Vietnam, and odds are it won't be a firefight. It'll be the heat, the heavy, wet heat that wrapped around you like a damp blanket and never let go. Then the smell, rotting vegetation, wet earth, sweat, and something metallic that lingered after gunfire. Before bullets, before strategy, there was this: the jungle itself. It wasn't just the backdrop. It was an enemy all its own. The Vietnamese jungle was thick, tangled, alive. Trees rose like columns, but between them grew a mess of vines and thorny underbrush. In some places, you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Paths weren't really paths, just dark tunnels carved by years of feet and rain. Rain. That was constant. Monsoons could dump water for days, turning trails into rivers and foxholes into bathtubs. When it wasn't raining, the air still dripped. Clothes never dried. Boots rotted on feet. Skin broke down into rashes. For a kid from Iowa or Detroit, it was like landing on another planet. And in that green world, Everything wanted to bite you. Mosquitoes carrying malaria, leeches that slid into socks, snakes coiled in mud, spiders big as fists. Even bamboo could cut. Soldiers joked about the jungle eating gear, but the truth? It ate men, too, wearing them down one sore, one fever, one sleepless night at a time. Then there were the traps. The Viet Cong didn't need fancy weapons. They had time and imagination. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo tipped with poison, waited at the bottom of pits. Tripwires triggered grenades hidden in cans. Mines hid under leaves. A patrol could move for hours without seeing an enemy. Then, snap, someone's leg was gone. The sound was quick, the screams weren't. Clearing a path became a slow dance, eyes scanning every twig, every lump in the ground. Even when you stopped to rest, the earth felt like it might bite back. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. Every step could kill you. And when you did see the enemy, they were often gone before you raised your rifle. Shadows that moved, voices that vanished. The jungle didn't just hide them, it seemed to fight for them. As if the surface wasn't bad enough, there was another world beneath, tunnels. The Viet Cong dug networks that stretched for miles, narrow, dark, and stifling. Down there were supply caches, hospitals, even living quarters. Entire units could vanish underground. American troops sometimes had to clear them. The job fell to tunnel rats, small, wiry soldiers armed with a pistol, a flashlight, and nerves of steel. They crawled on hands and knees through blackness, never knowing if a tripwire or an enemy waited ahead. Some tunnels were booby-trapped, some flooded, some alive with bats and rats. For those who went down, every breath felt borrowed. Daily life for an American grunt wasn't heroic charges. It was boredom punctuated by terror. Patrols through rice paddies and jungle thickets. Heat that made your canteen water taste like soup. Sea rations for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, meals that soldiers joked were designed to kill morale. Sleep was a luxury. Nights meant setting perimeter defenses, listening to the hum of insects and the thump of distant artillery, wondering if those shadows beyond the wire were moving. Letters from home became lifelines, read until the paper went soft. Some soldiers carried lucky charms, others carried doubts too heavy to share. And always, always, the question, who's the enemy? A farmer by day might be planting rice or hiding a rifle. A child could wave one moment and drop a grenade the next. That blurred line gnawed at men, leaving scars that didn't always heal when they left the jungle. Above all, there was the sound. The jungle wasn't silent. It hissed and chirped and buzzed. But layered over that came the distant thud of bombs, the chop of Huey rotors, the sudden crack of gunfire. Sometimes a firefight lasted minutes, sometimes hours, but it always seemed to come from nowhere. 1 second, a bird call. The next, chaos. Helicopters became angels and demons, bringing ammo, lifting the wounded, or arriving too late. Their rotors whipped the grass and rattled the teeth, their skids slick with mud and blood. For many soldiers, that sound never left their heads. Vietnam wasn't fought in neat lines, it was fought in a maze of green, mud, and fear. For U.S. soldiers, the jungle wasn't just terrain, it was a weapon, one the enemy knew how to wield. It tested patience, sanity, and bodies. Winning hearts and minds was hard enough. Winning in a place that seemed to swallow armies whole? That was something else. And as the war dragged on, the jungle didn't just chew up men, it chewed up illusions. The idea of a quick, clean fight was gone. What replaced it was something far murkier and far deadlier. Counterinsurgency sounded clever in briefing rooms. You don't just fight the guerrilla, you fight for the people. Feed them, protect them, earn their trust. Make the government seem like a friend instead of a tax collector. In theory, this meant building schools, digging wells, handing out medical care. Programs like the Strategic Hamlet Program were meant to wall off villages from Viet Cong influence. Families were moved into fortified hamlets with watchtowers and barbed wire, the idea being that if you could cut the guerrillas off from food and support, they would wither. Advisors talked about democracy, land reform, economic development. But theory and reality rarely matched. Moving families often meant uprooting them from ancestral homes. The hamlets were sometimes poorly defended, supplies thin, promises broken. To villagers, it could feel like being penned in by one side while being threatened by the other. The Viet Cong understood this war was about people, too. They didn't just shoot, they organized. They offered land to peasants, punished corrupt officials, and left messages that they were fighting for Vietnam's independence. They also killed, kidnapped, and terrorized. A village might give rice to the Viet Cong out of support or fear or both. American troops, meanwhile, were caught in the middle. They patrolled, guarded hamlets, handed out candy to children, and sometimes burned huts suspected of sheltering enemy fighters. For many soldiers, the lines blurred. Who was helping? Who was hiding weapons? The stress of never knowing could harden even good men. For some villages, American help was real: new roads, doctors, even security. For others, it was just another army passing through. The trouble was simple. A firefight could undo months of goodwill. A stray mortar shell could flatten a hut. A wrong raid could kill the wrong people. The Viet Cong knew this, often attacking and then vanishing, leaving angry families behind. Even the best-intentioned U.S. programs sometimes turned clumsy. Corruption in Saigon siphoned off funds. Some local officials saw aid as a way to enrich themselves. And in a war where allegiances shifted, a village that smiled one day might be hostile the next. For American soldiers, this was exhausting. They were trained to fight battles, not run clinics or judge loyalties. They could dig a well, but they couldn't fix decades of poverty and distrust in a few months. There were successes, and some units made real connections. Civil affairs teams brought medicine and tools. Special forces trained local militias. Some villages stayed loyal and prospered under protection. But these stories rarely made headlines. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, propaganda painted the Americans as occupiers, not saviors. Loudspeakers and leaflets told villagers the truth as they saw it. These men were here to keep Vietnam divided. And sometimes, when a helicopter thundered low over a field or an airstrike hit too close, the propaganda didn't need much help. For the Vietnamese farmer, it wasn't ideology, it was who kept their family safe and fed. And if that shifted with the wind, so did loyalty. The war for hearts and minds was really a war for trust. It was fragile, easily broken, and hard to rebuild. Every gift could be undercut by a single shot. Every promise could be erased by a single death. Looking back, this chapter of the war is important because it shows what modern conflicts learned and relearned. Guns alone rarely solve anything. Winning villages wasn't about who had the most helicopters, but who understood the people. And in Vietnam, that understanding often came too late or not at all. By the time strategies improved, the war had already grown teeth. By the start of 1968, many in Washington were telling themselves the war was turning. U.S. troop numbers were over 400,000, firepower was massive, and officials spoke of light at the end of the tunnel. But tunnels in Vietnam were often filled with surprises, and in late January, the surprise came. It wasn't a single attack. It was a wave, coordinated, shocking, and broadcast straight into American homes. It was called the Tet Offensive, and it changed everything. Tet is Vietnam's Lunar New Year, the biggest holiday on the calendar. Traditionally, even during conflict, Tet was a pause. Families gathered, markets bustled, and guns often went quiet. In January 1968, rumors swirled, but U.S. commanders still believed the enemy was hurting. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had taken losses. General William Westmoreland, the top U.S. commander, spoke of progress. Few expected what came next. Just before dawn on January 30th, as fireworks and celebrations echoed in towns and villages, the quiet broke. Attacks erupted not in one place, but across the country. Cities, provincial capitals, remote outposts, even air bases all hit. It wasn't one battle, it was hundreds. Nearly every major South Vietnamese city saw action. Saigon itself was struck. Guerrillas hit the U.S. Embassy compound. Hue, the old imperial capital, became a war zone for weeks. The fighting was fierce. In Hue, North Vietnamese forces dug in, and house-to-house battles raged. Streets that once carried tourists became kill zones. Civilians fled or hid. U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops fought block by block, sometimes at bayonet range. For soldiers in the field, it was chaos. Tet was supposed to be quiet, but suddenly villages erupted, mortars fell, convoys were ambushed. Even the safest places seemed fragile. Militarily, Tet was costly for the North. They lost tens of thousands of fighters, far more than U.S. or South Vietnamese forces. But war is more than numbers. For Americans watching television, Tet looked like proof that the enemy was everywhere. Until then, many had believed official reports that the U.S. was winning or at least holding steady. Tet shattered that image. Viewers saw smoke rising over Saigon, the embassy under attack, reporters in helmets ducking gunfire. The question wasn't just, are we winning, but what are we even doing? One of the most famous voices belonged to CBS's Walter Cronkite, the trusted news anchor. After visiting Vietnam, he told viewers the war seemed mired in stalemate. When the man known as the most trusted voice in America sounded weary, the country listened. President Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Among all the battles, Hugh stood out. The North seized much of the city and held it for nearly a month. When U.S. and South Vietnamese forces retook it, they found devastation. And they found something worse: evidence of mass executions carried out by communist forces, officials, teachers, priests. The images from Hue were haunting: walls pocked with bullets, families mourning, American Marines fighting through ancient gates. Even as the U.S. claimed victory there, the sense of fragility grew. Tet did something numbers couldn't. It showed Americans that the war wasn't nearly over. If the enemy could strike so widely, how close were we to control? Johnson's advisors split. Some urged escalation, more troops, more bombing. Others whispered what no one wanted to say: maybe this war couldn't be won the way it was being fought. At home, protests swelled. Students marched, veterans spoke out, and draft cards burned. Johnson's approval ratings sank. In March 1968, he stunned the nation. He announced he would not seek re-election. It wasn't only because of Tet, but the offensive was the breaking point. Tet was a military gamble that cost the North dearly, but it was a political triumph. It showed the world that the war was far from over, that the enemy could still surprise. It eroded U.S. confidence, emboldened critics, and shook the presidency itself. For the soldier, Tet was another brutal season. For the villager, it was another round of fear. But for the American public, it was a moment when the war came home, not in medals or parades, but in doubt. After Tet, the United States didn't just face an enemy, it faced its own questions. When the Tet offensive hit, the shock wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in American living rooms. Until then, the war had been far away, its battles described in press briefings and casualty numbers. But 1968 changed that. Suddenly, Americans were seeing firefights on the evening news. They were watching the U.S. embassy under attack, seeing Marines crouched behind walls, hearing gunfire while eating dinner. And at the center of that shift was a man with a calm voice and rimmed glasses, Walter Cronkite. It's hard to overstate Cronkite's influence. This was before social media, before cable news, before the internet. Most Americans got their information from 3 networks, and Cronkite was the trusted anchor on CBS. His sign-off, "and that's the way it is," was more than a catchphrase, it was a statement of record. During Tet, reporters were in the field, sending back vivid footage. Cronkite decided to go see it himself. In February 1968, he traveled to Vietnam, visiting bases, talking to troops, seeing the cities and villages scarred by weeks of fighting. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a protester. He was a journalist who wanted to understand. What he found was a war that looked nothing like the official briefings. Soldiers were exhausted, unsure what victory meant. Cities were damaged, and even after fierce fighting, the enemy was still there. On February 27, 1968, Cronkite ended his special broadcast with words that would echo through history. "The war," he said, was mired in stalemate, and the best America could hope for was to negotiate, not to win outright. It wasn't an angry speech. It wasn't radical. But for many Americans, it was a shock. If Walter Cronkite was saying this, if the man who delivered the news with calm authority was suggesting the war wasn't winnable, what did that mean? President Johnson reportedly told aides, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Whether he actually said those exact words doesn't matter. The sentiment did. Cronkite's report didn't turn the country against the war overnight, but it crystallized a growing doubt. Tet was the first time Americans saw a war unfold almost in real time. Photographs of the South Vietnamese police chief shooting a Viet Cong prisoner in the head. Marines carrying wounded through Hugh's rubble. Helicopters buzzing like bees, lifting men from smoky fields. It was the first living room war. And unlike World War II, where news was filtered and often heroic, Vietnam's images were raw. Soldiers looked scared. Villages burned. Civilians wept. The enemy wasn't faceless. Public opinion started to tilt. Before Tet, most Americans supported Johnson's policies or were unsure. After Tet and Cronkite's broadcast, more began to question the purpose, the cost, and the endgame. Protests grew louder. Letters to Congress shifted tone. Trust in official statements eroded. Cronkite was no anti-war crusader. He was respected for being measured, not emotional. That's why his words landed like a hammer. They didn't come from campus radicals or celebrity activists. They came from the man many considered America's voice of reason. His broadcast didn't end the war. It didn't make policy. But it helped open the door to skepticism. It made average Americans feel permitted to doubt. And when a democracy starts to doubt, politicians feel it. For Lyndon Johnson, Tet and Cronkite were twin blows. He was already struggling with unrest at home, civil rights battles, riots, an upcoming election. Vietnam was supposed to be a limited engagement. Now it was the nightly headline. Within weeks of Cronkite's report, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. There were other factors, but the symbolism of losing public trust was undeniable. His political capital had been drained, and much of it had spilled out in Southeast Asia. After Tet, the U.S. military still fought hard. Some battles were won. The enemy suffered heavy losses. But the aura of progress was gone. Even victories seemed costly. Even necessary actions felt doubtful. For the troops on the ground, little changed day to day. Patrols still went out. Firefights still erupted. The jungle still took its toll. But now they were fighting with a shadow back home, a sense that more and more Americans were asking whether it was worth it. Walter Cronkite didn't lose the war for America, but he gave voice to a question already forming: can this war be won, or should it be ended? His broadcast was like a mirror held up to a weary nation. It marked a moment when television stopped being just a window and became a force. It showed that in a democracy, perception can be as powerful as firepower. And in 1968, perception was shifting fast. By 1968, the Vietnam War was already straining America's patience and morale. Then came something darker, an event that shook even the most steadfast supporters. It wasn't about strategy or politics. It was about conscience. And it happened in a small hamlet called My Lai. One of the most brutal truths about Vietnam was that there were no clear fronts. Guerrillas blended into the population. Villagers could be friendly by day, hostile by night. Soldiers were young, scared, and often frustrated by an enemy they rarely saw. This pressure built over time. The Viet Cong had ambushed American units, booby traps killed comrades, and commanders demanded results. The body count became a measure of success, turning battles into statistics. That pressure could twist men. And on March 16, 1968, it did. Task Force Barker, part of the U.S. Army's Americal Division, moved into My Lai, a cluster of villages in Quang Ngai Province. Intelligence said it was a Viet Cong stronghold. The mission was simple on paper: search, destroy, and engage the enemy. But when the troops arrived, there was no firefight. Instead, they found mostly women, children, and old men. What happened next is still hard to read, even decades later. Over several hours, soldiers shot civilians, set homes on fire, and committed acts that defy explanation: rapes, killings, even babies. Estimates vary, but more than 500 Vietnamese were killed. Some soldiers refused to take part, some tried to stop it. But too many obeyed or turned away. There were no Viet Cong weapons found, just villagers. My Lai could have disappeared into the fog of war. Reports were filed but softened. Officers minimized what happened. For a time, it was another line in a daily report. But whispers spread. A helicopter pilot, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, who had tried to stop the massacre and even threatened to fire on fellow Americans to protect civilians, filed complaints. Soldiers who couldn't shake the memory spoke quietly. It took more than a year before the story broke. In late 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh exposed it. Graphic photographs followed, showing bodies in ditches, children clinging to mothers. Suddenly, the war wasn't just distant, it was morally searing. The reaction was explosive. Many Americans were horrified. Others were defensive, saying war was hell and confusion was inevitable. But My Lai was hard to explain away. These weren't armed combatants. They were civilians. For the anti-war movement, My Lai became a rallying cry, proof that the war was corrupting those sent to fight it. For soldiers still in the field, it was a shadow they carried. They were already fighting a war they didn't start. Now they were facing questions they couldn't easily answer. In 1971, Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader at My Lai, was court-martialed. He was found guilty of murder, but sentenced to life in prison, later reduced to house arrest. Many thought the punishment too light. Others thought he was a scapegoat for a larger failure of leadership. The trial forced a nation to look at itself. Could good men, under pressure, commit terrible acts? Was My Lai an exception or a symptom? The tragedy of My Lai wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the faces of villagers who had no politics, only homes. It was in the confusion of young soldiers sent into a war they barely understood. And it was in the reminder that war, when stretched long enough, can bend morality until it snaps. Some veterans would carry guilt for years. Others insisted they were following orders, that the enemy was everywhere. But My Lai made one thing clear: the Vietnam War was eating at more than bodies, it was eating at souls. My Lai stripped away any illusions that this was a clean war. It showed the cost of fighting an invisible enemy, of measuring success by numbers, of soldiers left to make impossible choices under impossible stress. It didn't cause America to lose the war. But it added a layer of doubt and shame that never really left. It gave fuel to protesters, anger to critics, and a wound to the veterans who fought honorably but were asked to explain the unexplainable. Sometimes wars are lost not on the battlefield, but in the heart. My Lai was one of those moments. By 1968, the war was no longer confined to the paddies and jungles of Vietnam. It was spilling onto American streets, into classrooms, onto television screens. The Tet Offensive, My Lai, mounting casualties, all were feeding a sense of frustration and anger. For many young Americans, Vietnam wasn't a faraway conflict. It was a letter in the mail, a friend's name on the nightly news, a flag-draped coffin coming home. And they were ready to shout about it. The draft made the war personal. Almost every family knew someone serving. College students worried about deferments. Working-class kids felt the net tightening. And with the nightly news showing firefights and body counts, it was hard to pretend this was just another foreign policy issue. The earliest protests were small, organized by pacifists, clergy, and some college groups. But by the mid-60s, they were swelling. Folk singers like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan were turning frustration into anthems. Professors were holding teach-ins, breaking down the history and the politics of the war. Then Tet hit, and suddenly, doubt wasn't just for the radicals. Parents, veterans, even politicians were asking, why are we there? Why so many dead? What's the plan? The protests grew louder, broader, and more confrontational. Vietnam cracked open a generational divide. Many older Americans, shaped by the Depression and World War II, believed in duty and anti-communism. They saw the protests as unpatriotic. Many younger Americans, coming of age in a time of relative prosperity, questioned authority, and wanted answers. It wasn't just about the war, it was about trust. Civil rights battles were raging. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke against Vietnam, tying it to poverty and racial injustice. Muhammad Ali refused induction, saying, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," and lost his heavyweight title. On campuses, students marched, occupied administration buildings, and challenged military recruiters. Some burned draft cards, some fled to Canada. Others, less peacefully, clashed with police. 1968 was a year of fire. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, sparking riots in cities across the country. Robert F. Kennedy, seen by many as a voice of reason and hope, was killed in June. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that summer turned into a televised street fight, with protesters chanting "The whole world is watching" as police swung batons and clouds of tear gas filled the air. Not all demonstrations were violent, but the images of bloodied students and helmeted police left a mark. To supporters, it was a moral outcry. To critics, it was chaos. And on May 4, 1970, at Kent State University, the unthinkable happened. National Guardsmen opened fire on students protesting the war's expansion into Cambodia. 4 were killed, 9 wounded. The photos, students crying over bodies, the shock frozen on faces, sent another shockwave through the country. The war became part of the culture. Songs like "Fortunate Son" and "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" played on radios. Magazines ran features on returning veterans, on protests, on draft evaders. Television kept showing the war's grind: helicopters, firefights, interviews with weary troops. Protesters carried signs: "Make love, not war. Bring our boys home. Hell no, we won't go." Some marches drew tens of thousands, some drew hundreds of thousands. Washington saw the largest protests in its history. The anti-war movement wasn't one thing. It was students, clergy, veterans, mothers, politicians. Some were peaceful, some militant. Groups like Students for a Democratic Society pushed for change. Others, like the Weather Underground, turned to violence. But together, they created a drumbeat that politicians could no longer ignore. Presidents felt the heat. Lyndon Johnson chose not to run again. Richard Nixon campaigned on peace with honor, but even he faced protests so large he sometimes slipped out the back door to avoid them. The movement didn't stop the war overnight, but it forced it into every conversation. Congress heard it. Candidates heard it. Soldiers heard it. It became impossible to separate the war in Vietnam from the unrest at home. Vietnam was never just about two armies, it was about two worlds colliding. In America, the war became a mirror reflecting deeper tensions: race, class, trust in government, the role of youth. The protests didn't all agree, and some went too far. But they changed the tone of the country. They forced leaders to defend every decision, every casualty. They gave a voice to doubt and made it echo. For the generation that lived it, the sound of helicopters will always be mixed with guitars, chants, and sometimes screams. They weren't just fighting a war, they were fighting over the meaning of America itself. When Richard Nixon took the oath of office in January 1969, he stepped into a storm. America was tired, angry, and divided. The Vietnam War was eating money, lives, and faith in government. Cities had burned in protest, college campuses were on edge, and the last president had bowed out rather than face the ballot. Nixon, a political survivor with a sharp mind and a sharp edge, promised something the country desperately wanted: peace with honor. Nixon knew what voters wanted to hear. His campaign framed him as the man to end the war but not lose it. He spoke about law and order for a restless home front and a silent majority of Americans who were weary of protests and chaos. For them, he said, he would restore calm. But his most careful phrase was peace with honor. He wouldn't just walk away. He wouldn't let Saigon fall without a fight. To Nixon, that meant finding a way to pull U.S. troops out while keeping South Vietnam standing. Behind the scenes, though, he inherited a mess. The Viet Cong were still active, the North was unbowed, and Saigon's politics were fragile. The war machine was grinding on, and Nixon needed a plan. One of Nixon's first moves was to shift the burden. He called it Vietnamization, train and equip South Vietnamese forces to take over more of the fighting while American troops gradually withdrew. It sounded good, give them guns, give them helicopters, give them the lead. The U.S. poured resources into the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Advisors trained them, American weapons filled armories, and new units were formed. The idea was that ARVN could handle the war and American boys could come home. But Vietnamization had a flaw. South Vietnam's military had brave soldiers, but leadership was uneven, corruption was common, and morale was shaky. The North knew this and kept the pressure on. Nixon's challenge wasn't just training soldiers, it was trying to build a nation on a tight deadline. While Nixon talked about winding down, he also expanded. To hit North Vietnamese supply lines, he authorized secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos, aimed at the Ho Chi Minh Trail. B-52s thundered over jungle, flattening swaths of land. These strikes were hidden from the public at first, but they showed Nixon's dual nature, one hand shaking for peace, the other clenched in a fist. The war was no longer confined to Vietnam, it was bleeding across borders. When the bombings came to light, protests surged again. Critics said Nixon was widening a war he promised to end. Supporters said he was trying to force Hanoi to negotiate. Either way, the line between peace and war blurred even further. Peace talks had begun in Paris before Nixon took office, but they were stalled. Hanoi demanded U.S. withdrawal and a role for the Viet Cong in any government. Saigon resisted fiercely. Nixon's team, including Henry Kissinger, worked behind closed doors, balancing carrots and sticks, bombing raids, secret channels to Moscow and Beijing, and offers of negotiation. Kissinger's meetings with North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc though became a careful dance. Nixon also tried to reshape the bigger board, opening relationships with China and the Soviet Union to pressure Hanoi. It was classic Nixon, think globally, act tactically. But every week negotiations dragged, more names appeared on casualty lists. At home, Nixon faced a country still on edge. The draft was still pulling young men in, protests hadn't stopped. In 1970, the invasion of Cambodia set campuses on fire, literally. Students marched, police clashed, and the Kent State shootings, with 4 students dead, shocked the world. Nixon responded with defiance. He called protesters bums on one occasion and rallied what he called the silent majority, those who supported the troops, distrusted radicals, and wanted an end to chaos. He believed they were with him, and for a while, many were. But the news kept showing coffins, and the war seemed endless. Nixon promised withdrawals, and numbers did come down from over 500,000 troops in 1969 to fewer than 200,000 by 1972, but the fighting didn't end. Every withdrawal was shadowed by another offensive, another bombing, another reason to stay. Nixon's arrival marked a shift. The war became as much about politics as about territory. He wanted out, but on his terms. That meant balancing diplomacy and escalation, withdrawals and secret wars, public promises and private moves. For soldiers in the field, it didn't matter what the strategy was called. Patrols still went out, friends still fell, helicopters still came for the wounded. But in Washington, the language changed: Vietnamization, peace with honor, negotiations. Nixon's war was quieter in some ways, louder in others. And while he pulled Americans out, the conflict was far from finished. The most intense fighting was yet to come. By 1969, Nixon's promise of peace with honor sounded simple enough: get Americans out, keep South Vietnam standing. But wars aren't simple. And while Nixon talked withdrawal, he also widened the battlefield. The plan was called Vietnamization, but its story can't be told without another word: Cambodia. At its heart, Vietnamization was Nixon's attempt to hand the war back to the South Vietnamese. The plan was to train, equip, and expand the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, so it could handle more of the fighting. The U.S. would keep supplying air power and advisors, but the boots in the mud would be theirs. On paper, it looked smart. American casualties could drop, public anger at home might cool, and the South could prove its strength. Troop levels did start to shrink. Over 500,000 Americans were in Vietnam when Nixon took office. By 1972, fewer than 200,000 remained. But Vietnamization had flaws from the start. The ARVN had brave soldiers and some skilled officers, but it also had corruption, desertion, and weak leadership. Many units relied on U.S. logistics, intelligence, and air cover. And while numbers grew, experience and morale often lagged. The South was learning to walk while the North was still running. Meanwhile, the war was never just in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had a secret weapon: geography. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wound through Laos and Cambodia like veins, carrying men and weapons south. As American troops withdrew, those trails became more critical. Nixon and his advisors knew this. And so, even while saying America was pulling back, they struck where the maps blurred. Starting in March 1969, the U.S. launched a secret bombing campaign over Cambodia, codenamed Menu. Targets were supply caches, trail networks, jungle sanctuaries. B-52 bombers thundered over areas officially neutral, dropping tons of explosives. The public knew nothing. Congress didn't know much either. The secrecy was deliberate, but secrecy in war rarely lasts. When the bombings came to light, many Americans were stunned. Nixon was supposed to be winding the war down, but here he was expanding it. In April 1970, the quiet war in Cambodia turned loud. Cambodia's leader, Prince Sihanouk, was overthrown by a pro-American general, Lon Nol. The North Vietnamese took advantage of the chaos, expanding their bases deeper into Cambodian territory. Nixon made a decision: send U.S. and ARVN forces across the border. Officially, it was a limited incursion to clean out sanctuaries. In reality, it was the first time many Americans saw the war spreading to another country. American and South Vietnamese troops stormed border areas, capturing caches of weapons and supplies. The raids were militarily successful in some ways, disrupting operations for a while. But they came at a political cost. When Americans saw maps of Cambodia on TV, saw students marching, and heard that their sons were fighting in a place Congress hadn't even declared war on, outrage grew. To critics, it looked like Nixon had broken his promise of de-escalation. The Cambodia incursion set campuses on fire. Protests erupted nationwide. At Kent State University in Ohio, students rallied against the war. On May 4, 1970, the Ohio National Guard opened fire on a crowd, killing 4 students and wounding 9. The images, students crying over fallen friends, were broadcast everywhere. The shock was deep. Nixon had hoped to strengthen his hand. Instead, he found the country angrier than ever. The chant, "Bring our boys home," grew louder. Congress pushed back, passing measures to limit presidential war powers. For many Americans, Cambodia was proof that the war had become a shifting, endless thing, one that could spill anywhere, anytime. Vietnamization looked good in speeches, but in the field it was mixed. Some ARVN units fought well. Others collapsed under pressure. Desertion rates were high, corruption sapped supplies. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese weren't waiting politely. They hit ARVN units hard, probing weaknesses, testing defenses. Without steady U.S. ground support, the South often struggled to hold territory. Air power remained the Americans' advantage, but even that couldn't fill every gap. The Cambodian incursion had bought time, but not much. Vietnamization was a gamble. It wasn't just about training soldiers, it was about building confidence in a government that was often fragile. It also showed Nixon's paradox: talk withdrawal, but fight harder in secret when needed. Cambodia proved something else. War has a way of spreading. What looked like a local fight spilled over borders, into other countries, into American classrooms, into living rooms. By the early 1970s, the war was no longer about who had more troops, it was about who had more will. And both sides, in their own ways, were running short. By spring 1970, the war had already spilled across borders into Cambodia, and back home, patience was gone. For years, protests had grown louder, draft cards burned brighter, and the news from Vietnam darker. But nothing prepared America for what would happen on an ordinary college campus in Ohio, a tragedy that became a symbol, a turning point, and, for some, a final straw. Nixon's decision to send U.S. and ARV-N troops into Cambodia in April 1970 was meant to disrupt enemy supply lines. Militarily, it scored some gains, caches captured, bases disrupted. But politically, it was gasoline on an open flame. Many Americans thought Nixon was winding down the war. Instead, they saw him widening it. Students, already frustrated by the draft and the nightly news of body counts, felt betrayed. On campuses across the country, protests erupted. Some were peaceful, some raucous, some turned into running battles with police. Kent State University in Ohio was one of those flashpoints. On May 1st, students held demonstrations. By May 2nd, an ROTC building on campus was burned. The National Guard was called in. Tensions climbed. Troops in helmets patrolled the lawns of a college campus. By Monday, May 4th, hundreds gathered to protest the war and the presence of armed soldiers on their school grounds. Guardsmen ordered the crowd to disperse. Students jeered. Tear gas was fired, rocks thrown. Then, on a hill, the guard turned. No one knows exactly why the shots rang out. Perhaps confusion, fear, poor command. But suddenly the rifles cracked. 67 rounds in 13 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 4 students were dead: Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder. 9 others were wounded. Some weren't even protesting, they were walking to class. A photograph caught the aftermath: a young woman, Mary and Vecchio, kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body, arms outstretched in shock. It was front-page news everywhere. Television replayed the chaos. The reaction was instant. To some, the Guard were defending order. To many more, they were symbols of a government willing to turn its guns on its own children. That single image traveled faster than any speech. Campuses erupted again. Strikes spread to hundreds of universities. Classes were canceled. Parents called senators. The war, once something happening over there, now had blood on an American lawn. Nixon was rattled. He had spoken tough about bums on campuses, but Kent State was different. 4 kids were dead. The White House insisted the incursion into Cambodia was necessary. They pointed to vandalism and threats to justify the Guard's presence. But the damage to trust was real. Congress began to push back. Efforts to rein in presidential war powers gained momentum. The anti-war movement, which had sometimes seemed fringe, suddenly felt like the mainstream. Kent State didn't cause the protests, it confirmed the fears. The war was dividing not just parties, but generations. To many parents, the chaos of campuses was frightening. To many students, the sight of troops with rifles on a quad was unthinkable. Even veterans returning home felt the chill. Some were proud, some were bitter, some were caught in the middle of a conversation the country wasn't ready to have. And still, Vietnam went on. The Ho Chi Minh Trail carried supplies. Bombers flew. Villages fought over flags. Yet at home, something fundamental shifted. The patience to keep pouring blood and treasure into the conflict was thinning faster than ever. Kent State was about more than 4 deaths. It was about a country reaching a limit. It was about kids and soldiers, about authority and trust, about what happens when the distance between citizens and leaders grows too wide. It showed that Vietnam wasn't just testing soldiers overseas, it was testing the very fabric of America. After Kent State, every speech, every bombing, every casualty report landed heavier. Nixon's silent majority still supported him, but the silence was cracking. The noise of grief and anger was too loud to ignore. By 1971, Americans were tired. The troop numbers were shrinking, but the casualties kept coming. The protests were louder, the families more anxious, the headlines more grim. And then, like a crack in a dam, came something few expected: a secret history of the war, spilling across newspapers, revealing things the public had never been told. They called it the Pentagon Papers, and it changed the conversation from doubt to mistrust. Back in 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had begun to doubt the war himself, ordered a massive study. It was meant to be internal, thousands of pages, covering decades of decisions, from Truman to Johnson. It documented not just the battles, but the politics, the false starts, the missed chances, the quiet doubts, the public optimism that didn't always match reality. It wasn't meant for the public eye. It was meant for lessons learned. But one man, Daniel Ellsberg, a defense analyst who had seen the war up close and lost faith in it, decided the lessons couldn't wait. Ellsberg believed the public had a right to know. In 1971, he began secretly copying the top-secret documents. Then he went to the press. The New York Times published the first excerpts in June, splashing headlines that stunned readers. Administrations had misled the public about progress, underestimated the enemy, and overstated successes. It was an avalanche. The documents didn't just criticize one party, they covered Democratic and Republican administrations. They showed a pattern: leaders who knew things weren't going well, but kept saying otherwise. For many Americans, it wasn't just disappointing, it was infuriating. Parents had buried sons. Communities had carried the weight of a war they were told was necessary and winnable. Now the papers suggested something darker. Maybe it was never that simple. The Nixon administration, though much of the material predated him, saw the leak as a threat. If classified documents could pour out, what else might? The Justice Department moved fast, getting a court order to stop the Times. It was the first time in American history that the government had tried to halt a major newspaper in mid-story. But other papers jumped in, most famously the Washington Post. The leak spread, state by state, headline by headline. The fight went to the Supreme Court, and in a landmark decision, the court ruled 6-3. The press had the right to publish. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors, wrote Justice Hugo Black. Nixon fumed. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act. But even his trial became messy. When it came out that the White House had authorized break-ins to find dirt on him, the case collapsed. The Pentagon Papers didn't reveal treason. They didn't show America fighting on the wrong side. What they showed was something subtler and perhaps more damaging, that leaders were often more worried about losing face than losing lives. For the public, already weary from Kent State, Cambodia, and years of fighting, the leak confirmed the worst suspicion, that the war wasn't just hard, it might have been built on half-truths. For soldiers still in the field, it was salt in the wound. Letters home now carried more than stories of heat and fear, they carried questions. Why became heavier. Though the papers largely covered previous administrations, the damage to trust bled into Nixon's time. He saw enemies everywhere, worried about leaks, and created the Plumbers, a group tasked with stopping them. That paranoia would spiral into something else later, Watergate. But in 1971, the focus was still on Vietnam. The war was now a war of credibility as much as guns. Could anyone believe the briefings? Could anyone believe the numbers? The Pentagon Papers didn't end the war, but they shifted its weight. They showed that wars aren't just fought on battlefields, they are fought in words, in promises, in the trust between leaders and the led. When that trust cracks, it's hard to mend. For Americans in 1971, the war wasn't just painful, it was personal. And now it was also suspect. By 1972, America's combat role in Vietnam was shrinking, but the war wasn't done. Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization was meant to put the fighting back in South Vietnamese hands, but the North was watching and waiting. When they struck, it wasn't a whisper of guerrillas. It was thundering. They called it the Easter Offensive, and it was the biggest gamble yet. On March 30th, 1972, as Americans were preparing for Easter weekend, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive attack. It wasn't small units this time. It was divisions, tanks, artillery, and thousands of troops pouring across the demilitarized zone. They hit the northern provinces, central highlands, and even the Mekong Delta. For the first time, Americans saw Soviet-made T-54 tanks rolling across Vietnamese fields. Villages were overrun, outposts collapsed. South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, were tested like never before. Some units held bravely, some panicked, and some crumbled. The offensive shook Saigon's confidence and Washington's nerves. For Nixon, the timing was awful. He was running for re-election and negotiating with Hanoi and Paris. A collapse could be a political disaster. But Nixon was not one to flinch. He decided to hit back hard. He unleashed Operation Linebacker, the most intense bombing campaign of the war. The gloves came off. B-52s roared north, striking supply lines, bridges, and railroads. U.S. Navy jets mined Haiphong Harbor, choking off supplies. Unlike Rolling Thunder, this time the rules were looser. Nixon told the military to go after the infrastructure that kept the North fighting. The message was clear: if you want escalation, we'll give you escalation. For pilots, Linebacker was both terrifying and decisive. North Vietnam had learned lessons. Soviet surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided guns made the skies deadly. American planes were shot down, pilots captured or killed. But the bombing was relentless. The North's supply routes were shredded, fuel and ammunition were scarce. Even the famously resilient Ho Chi Minh Trail felt the strain. In the South, U.S. advisors and air power helped stiffen ARVN defenses. Helicopters moved reinforcements, jets pounded enemy columns. The Easter offensive stalled and then rolled back. By late summer, South Vietnamese forces, with heavy American help, retook much of the ground. Why did the North gamble? The timing was partly strategic. With U.S. troops leaving, Hanoi wanted to prove the South couldn't stand alone. They also wanted leverage at the peace talks. A battlefield success could mean better terms. Nixon understood that too. His bombing wasn't just military, it was political. He wanted to show Hanoi, and Moscow and Beijing, that America might be leaving, but it wasn't weak. And there was another layer: the 1972 election. Nixon needed to look strong. When the Easter offensive failed to topple the South, he could claim Vietnamization was working. The Easter offensive and Linebacker shook the Paris talks. Hanoi saw that America still had teeth. Nixon saw that the South could fight if backed. Both sides were bloodied but cautious. The talks dragged on, but a message was clear. Even as the U.S. withdrew ground troops, its air power was unmatched. Nixon was signaling that peace would come on American terms or with American bombs. The Easter offensive proved something that both sides knew but rarely said: the war wasn't just jungles and ambushes anymore. It was tanks, artillery, and jets. It was technology and will colliding. For the ARVN, it was a grim but necessary test. They bled but held, mostly because U.S. planes roared overhead. For the North, it was proof that they could still strike hard. For Americans at home, it was a reminder: even when the war seemed to be winding down, it could flare up suddenly, savagely. And the president, who promised to end it, was still willing to turn up the heat when cornered. By late 1972, the war was dragging like a weary march. Most U.S. troops were gone, but the fighting was not. Nixon, fresh from a landslide re-election victory, wanted an endgame. His team, led by Henry Kissinger, had been meeting with Hanoi's Le Duc in Paris, inching toward a deal. But the negotiations were stalling, the language tricky, the politics messier than anyone admitted. And Nixon was not a man who liked to be stalled. Through 1972, Kissinger and though had danced around terms: U.S. withdrawal, prisoner exchanges, recognition of the South's government, and whether North Vietnamese troops could stay in the South. By autumn, they were close. Kissinger famously said, "Peace is at hand," in October. The headlines sounded promising. But promises in war are fragile. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thieu, feared being abandoned. He wanted guarantees, more weapons, more leverage. Hanoi wanted the world to see that their forces were legitimate. Each side accused the other of stalling. As weeks turned into December, tempers rose. Nixon believed the North was playing for time, waiting for America's will to crack. So he made a decision. If negotiation wasn't enough, shock might be. On December 18, 1972, the roar came. For 11 days, American B-52 bombers and fighter jets pounded Hanoi, Haiphong, and key targets in North Vietnam. It was the heaviest bombing of the entire war. Bridges collapsed, power plants shattered, rail yards burned. Civilians huddled in shelters. Anti-aircraft fire lit the night skies. The world reacted sharply. Allies condemned the scale. Anti-war activists called it barbaric. The images of smoke rising from Hanoi's streets were stark, even as Washington insisted the targets were military. For the North, it was brutal. Dozens of American bombers were lost, crews captured. But the message was clear. Nixon was willing to unleash maximum pressure to finish the war. Some historians argue the bombings were unnecessary theatrics. Others say they were cold calculation. Nixon wanted to show strength to Hanoi and reassure Saigon. He needed the North to sign, and he needed Thieu to believe America wasn't cutting and running. The Christmas bombings were meant to say, we may be leaving, but we can still hit back harder than ever. It worked, or at least it broke the deadlock. In January 1973, negotiators returned to the table. On January 27th, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The terms: a ceasefire across Vietnam, U.S. withdrawal of combat troops, return of American POWs. North Vietnamese troops could remain in the South, but were not to advance. The South's government would stay in power, at least for now. For Nixon, it was a victory of sorts. American prisoners came home. Troops were coming out. The war, at least America's war, seemed to be ending. But beneath the ink was a quiet truth. Nothing had really been settled. Two armies still faced each other. The South was still fragile, the North still determined. The peace was a pause, not a finish. For Americans, though, it was enough. After years of casualty lists, protests, and bitter politics, the sight of POWs stepping off planes, waving weak but proud, felt like closure. The draft was ending. The helicopters, for a moment, were quiet. But the images of Christmas bombings lingered too. Some saw them as unnecessary cruelty. Others saw them as proof that Nixon had the will to finish what others couldn't. Either way, the war was leaving scars on villages and voters alike. The Christmas bombings were the last great roar of American power in Vietnam. They were a statement. The U.S. could still shake the ground, but it couldn't control the outcome. The Paris Peace Accords brought troops home, but they didn't bring true peace. The war had shifted, not ended. For the Vietnamese, the struggle would continue. For America, the chapter was closing, but the story wasn't done. By early 1973, the war America had carried for nearly a decade seemed finally to be loosening its grip. The Paris Peace Accords were signed, U.S. combat troops were coming home, and POWs were stepping off planes to waving crowds. For the first time in years, there was talk of closure. But leaving a war is never tidy. The end of America's combat role was messy, political, and loud, full of victory laps, bitterness, and questions no one really wanted to answer. The images in early 1973 were some of the most emotional of the entire war. American prisoners, gaunt but alive, walking off planes and saluting. Families clung to them, TV cameras captured tears, and for a brief moment, the war seemed to have something worth celebrating. The draft, which had haunted young men for a decade, was winding down. For many, that was as big as the peace itself. The letters that once threatened to change a life were gone. The number lottery ended. A generation could breathe. But behind the smiles was a quieter, heavier truth. Many came home carrying more than duffel bags. They carried wounds, some visible, some not. PTSD wasn't widely understood then, but it was there, in sleepless nights, in tempers, in silence. And for every soldier who came home, another name was etched on a memorial that didn't yet exist. In Vietnam, the Americans were leaving, but not leaving nothing. Billions in equipment stayed: planes, tanks, helicopters, weapons. The South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, inherited an arsenal, along with the impossible task of holding a fractured country together. Advisors stayed in smaller numbers, along with CIA operatives and support crews. Bombers still flew missions for a time, especially in Cambodia and Laos. And Saigon's dependence didn't vanish, it deepened. For the villages and cities of South Vietnam, the departure was bittersweet. Many welcomed fewer foreign boots on their roads, others feared what would come next. Old rivalries hadn't gone anywhere. The North Vietnamese troops were still in the south, waiting, watching. Back home, Nixon declared victory of a kind. He framed the Paris Accords as a just end, an honorable withdrawal. His popularity soared briefly. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc though even shared the Nobel Peace Prize, though refused it. But peace was fragile. The ceasefire was broken almost as soon as the ink dried. Skirmishes flared, towns changed hands. Nixon promised more aid, more weapons if the South were attacked. But Watergate was closing in, and America's appetite for another round was gone. Congress, tired of war and suspicious of executive power, cut funds and limited Nixon's reach. The days of blank checks were over. For U.S. soldiers, coming home wasn't always the embrace they imagined. Some returned to cheers, others stepped into a country weary of the war and divided over its meaning. Unlike World War II's parades, Vietnam veterans often found themselves slipping quietly back into civilian life, sometimes met with indifference, sometimes hostility. Jobs were hard to find, benefits tangled in red tape. Many carried injuries, physical and emotional, that would take years to acknowledge. For some, the hardest part wasn't the fighting, it was feeling forgotten. The Paris deal didn't stop the bombs completely. U.S. air power continued to hammer Cambodia and Laos into 1973, trying to disrupt enemy supply lines and prop up shaky governments. These wars within the war rarely made front pages, but they added to the toll. Villages burned, families displaced. And the North Vietnamese? They bided their time. They rebuilt, rearmed, and waited for the moment when America's promises to the South would no longer matter. America leaves, but not quietly, is a reminder that wars rarely end when the planes fly home. They taper, they shift, they echo. For the U.S., leaving Vietnam was not a clean break, it was a step away while fires still smoldered. For many Americans, 1973 felt like an ending. But in the paddies and cities of Vietnam, the fighting was far from finished. The story was moving into a new act, one where the U.S. would watch from afar as the country it once pledged to protect faced the storm alone. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, it seemed like the war chapter was closing for America. Troops were coming home, prisoners were returning, and Nixon and Kissinger spoke confidently about peace with honor. But history has a sense of timing, and just as one fire was cooling, another began to burn in Washington. It had nothing to do with jungles or battlefields, but it would have more impact on Vietnam than any bombing raid. It was called Watergate. At the start of 1973, Richard Nixon was at the peak of his political power. He'd won re-election in a landslide, carried nearly every state, and seemed untouchable. Vietnam was no longer nightly news. The homecoming of POWs and the end of the draft gave many Americans a sense of relief. But the war's shadow lingered. South Vietnam was still fragile, the North unbowed. Nixon promised to keep supporting Saigon with weapons and air power if needed. He assured President Nguyen Van Thieu that the U.S. would stand by its ally. Then came a burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex, a small story at first, a handful of men caught with tape and flashlights. Few could have guessed that this would unravel a presidency. The Watergate break-in in June 1972 didn't immediately grab the public. But investigative reporters, most famously Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of The Washington Post, kept digging. They found money trails, cover-ups, and connections that led closer to the White House. Hearings began. Testimony revealed secret tapes, slush funds, political espionage. Nixon's famous toughness now looked like secrecy and paranoia. The same man who said peace with honor was fighting to keep control of a story that kept slipping. By mid-1973, the Senate Watergate hearings were being broadcast daily. Americans watched staffers testify about crimes and cover-ups. The war faded into the background. Vietnam's survival depended on U.S. attention and aid, but Washington was consumed by its own crisis. For South Vietnam, Watergate was a silent earthquake. They needed American weapons, money, and air support to keep the North at bay. Nixon had promised to provide them. But each week, as the scandal deepened, Congress grew less willing to trust him. When the president's credibility crumbled, so did his influence. He could no longer push for more aid without hearing questions about his honesty. By late 1973 and into 1974, the budget for South Vietnam's military began shrinking. Saigon was fighting harder, but with fewer resources. The North noticed. Hanoi read newspapers, too. They saw a distracted superpower and waited. The scandal worsened. The White House tapes became a symbol of Nixon's fight to keep secrets. When parts were released, they showed a man obsessed with enemies, willing to use power recklessly. The public mood soured. In August 1974, facing almost certain impeachment, Richard Nixon resigned. The image of him waving goodbye from a helicopter on the White House lawn was a sharp contrast to his earlier promises of strength. For South Vietnam, Nixon's fall was devastating. The man who had pledged bombs if the North broke the peace was gone. His successor, Gerald Ford, was less powerful, and Congress, tired of war and scandal, wanted no more blank checks. While Watergate unfolded, the North Vietnamese rebuilt. They replenished supplies, regrouped forces, and planned. They knew that if they waited long enough, the Americans would be too distracted, too divided to return in force. For the South, it was a lonely fight. The U.S. still sent equipment, but the sense of an unshakable ally was gone. Nixon's credibility had been their shield. When it cracked, so did the promise behind it. Watergate is remembered as a political scandal, but for Vietnam, it was also a turning point. It showed that wars are not just lost on battlefields, they can be lost in committee rooms, courtrooms, and on TV screens. The war that once consumed Washington was now background noise to a scandal that consumed a presidency. And when America turned inward, the clock started ticking louder for Saigon. The U.S. could still fly planes and ship guns, but it had lost something essential: focus. And in war, focus can be everything. By early 1975, the war that had consumed a generation was now running on fumes. The Americans were gone, their combat role reduced to advisors and aid. The Paris Peace Accords were 2 years old and already broken in spirit, if not in name. The South Vietnamese government stood alone, proud but nervous, facing an enemy that had waited patiently for this moment. And in the shadows, Hanoi was ready to make its move. South Vietnam had never been strong on its own. Even with American troops, corruption and politics had weakened its core. The ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, had brave soldiers, but leadership was uneven and morale often low. Supplies were shrinking, too. After Watergate and Nixon's resignation, Congress was in no mood to fund another surge of weapons and money. President Nguyen Van Thieu pleaded for help, but Washington was distracted. The U.S. had its own crises: inflation, oil shocks, political scandals. The appetite for war spending was gone. Aid dropped dramatically, ammunition, fuel, spare parts all began to run thin. North Vietnam saw its chance. In December 1974, the North Vietnamese launched an offensive in the Central Highlands, capturing the provincial capital of Phuc Long. It was a test, and the U.S. didn't respond. No bombers, no Marines, just statements. Hanoi read the silence as a green light. By March 1975, the offensive widened. Tanks, artillery, and well-trained troops swept south, striking Van My Thuet. ARVN units fought, but without American air power, they were outgunned. The South tried to regroup, but panic spread. Villages emptied, highways clogged with refugees, convoys jammed with trucks and carts. Saigon was still far away, but the sense of collapse was in the air. President Thieu made a controversial decision: pull back from the Central Highlands to defend coastal cities. But the retreat was chaotic. Roads jammed, units broke apart, civilians streamed alongside soldiers. The convoy of tears along Route 7B became a grim symbol: families and fighters fleeing together under fire, leaving homes behind. The North moved fast. Hue, Da Nang, Nha Trang, all cities Americans had once fought hard to hold, fell in weeks. To the outside world, It looked like a dam bursting. Years of holding lines were swept away in a matter of days. In Washington, President Gerald Ford could do little. He asked Congress for emergency aid, more weapons, more money to stabilize Saigon. Congress said no. Public opinion was firmly against another check for a war most believed was over.
Ford was frustrated, but the political reality was clear. The American people were done. Even if planes could be sent, even if money flowed, no one wanted to reopen the wounds. For the first time in years, the South Vietnamese were truly on their own. In Saigon, the mood shifted from defiance to dread. Streets were still busy, but rumors swirled. Officials quietly moved families abroad. Businessmen sent money overseas. Radio broadcasts urged calm, but people knew better. The U.S. Embassy was still staffed, but now its job was mostly symbolic. Advisors and diplomats stayed, watching events like passengers on a ship taking water. Every victory the North won felt closer, heavier. For many in the South, hope shrank to a single thought: how to leave. The spring of 1975 was fast and cruel. What had taken years of blood and treasure to build unraveled in weeks. The South Vietnamese fought, but without American air cover, without steady supplies, they were fighting uphill with bare hands. For the U.S., this was a sobering moment. Watching from the sidelines, Americans saw the limits of power. Billions spent, tens of thousands of lives lost. And in the end, the outcome was slipping away almost without a fight. The Fall of Saigon Begins is a chapter about speed, the kind of speed that only comes when pressure finally cracks the dam. And this was only the beginning. By April 1975, South Vietnam was unraveling fast. The North Vietnamese weren't creeping anymore. They were racing. Cities were falling, roads were jammed, and the South's army, though still fighting bravely in spots, was cracking under the weight of panic and empty supplies. Saigon, once bustling and confident, was suddenly a city on borrowed time. And for tens of thousands of people, the question wasn't ideology or politics anymore. It was survival. In early April, Saigon still had the trappings of normal life. Cafes open, markets busy, traffic honking through the streets. But beneath that rhythm, fear hummed like a hidden wire. Rumors spread with each day. Da Nang had fallen. Nha Trang was gone. Hue, the old capital, was lost. Each loss moved the war closer to the city. Planes roared overhead, carrying the wounded south. Soldiers on leave crowded bars and worried about their families. Officials quietly packed documents and valuables. Those with money bought black market tickets out. Those without prayed for a chance. For many South Vietnamese, especially those tied to the government or the Americans, the fear was sharp. What would happen if the North came? Would there be reprisals? Prison camps? Worse, families who had worked with Americans, translators, pilots, clerks, feared being marked as traitors. Thousands rushed to the U.S. Embassy gates, waving papers, pleading for help. The embassy, designed for diplomacy, became a fortress of desperation. Marines reinforced its walls. Lists of evacuees grew. By mid-April, the U.S. knew time was nearly gone. President Ford ordered the final evacuation plan, Operation Frequent Wind. Helicopters, not ships, would carry people out. Airstrips were too risky. The runways could be shelled or overrun. On April 29th, the signal came. A radio broadcast played White Christmas, Bing Crosby's voice floating over the airwaves. It was the code for all Americans and allies. It's time. At the embassy, crowds surged. Marines formed lines, trying to keep order. Helicopters landed on the roof, whisking away diplomats, officials, families. The rotor wash-churned papers and dust. The streets outside were chaos. Thousands who would never get out pressed against the gates. Inside, lists were checked and rechecked. Every seat mattered. For many, the final ride meant leaving everything behind. Homes, friends, even children in some heartbreaking cases. The pictures from those 2 days are burned into memory. Helicopters lifting off from rooftops, people climbing ladders, embassy staff burning documents. One famous photo, often mistaken for the embassy, showed an apartment rooftop with a line of evacuees waiting for a Marine to wave them aboard. By the evening of April 29th, the perimeter was shrinking. Marines destroyed radios, equipment, even cars. By dawn on April 30th, the last helicopters were lifting off, leaving behind a city now echoing with artillery. In all, nearly 7,000 people were airlifted out during frequent wind, but tens of thousands more were left behind. For them, the war's end would mean something else: re-education camps, escape by boat, or life under a new flag. Back home, the images were shocking and sad. After years of headlines, this was the end game, a mad dash, a city falling. Some Americans felt anger. How could it end like this after so much? Others felt relief. It was finally over. For the soldiers who had served, the scenes were hard to watch. Allies left behind, friends scrambling for rides, years of effort collapsing in days. Many wondered, was it worth it? The flight from Saigon was more than an evacuation. It was a reckoning. It showed the limits of power and the fragility of trust. It showed that war is not just fought by armies, but by clerks, drivers, translators, and families whose lives hinge on a piece of paper or a seat on a helicopter. It was the final proof that America's Vietnam War was over, not with a treaty or a victory parade, but with the thrum of rotor blades over a city in panic. On the morning of April 30th, 1975, the world's cameras turned to Saigon. The skyline shimmered with heat, but the sound was not traffic or street vendors. It was artillery thuds and the steady chop of rotor blades fading into distance. The war that had started as an obscure conflict, grown into America's obsession, and split a nation was about to end, not with a treaty at Versailles or a surrender ceremony on a battleship, but with something quieter and more heartbreaking: a city changing hands. By dawn, the U.S. evacuation was over. Marines had lifted the last groups of Americans and some South Vietnamese allies out of the embassy rooftop under Operation Frequent Wind. At 4:58 a.m., the final helicopter cleared the roof, leaving behind hundreds still at the gates and a city bracing for its fate. Inside the embassy, shredded papers and burned files were all that remained of years of work. Radios crackled with final instructions. Marines boarded choppers in silence. They had orders: no more landings. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu had already resigned weeks earlier, blaming America's abandonment. His successor, Duong Van Minh, Big Minh, had only been in office 2 days when the North Vietnamese tanks rolled toward the city. By mid-morning, the rumble of engines was unmistakable. Columns of North Vietnamese armor were pushing through the suburbs. Civilians lined the roads, watching quietly, some fearful, some relieved. There are no great battles now. Resistance had mostly melted away. At around 10:30 a.m., a Soviet-made T-54 tank smashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Soldiers ran across the lawns, planting flags. Big Minh met them inside. His words were brief: "The South Vietnamese government is ready to surrender." There was no ceremony, no negotiation. The message went out on radios across the country: Saigon has been liberated. For the victors, it was reunification. For the defeated, it was the end of a dream. In the streets, people waited. Some celebrated openly, waving flags, singing. Others locked doors and hid. Families who had worked with the Americans braced for knock on the door. The fear of re-education camps, of reprisals, was real. There was confusion, too. Where were the Americans? Why had they gone? The embassy compound was empty, its gates now quiet. For many, the day wasn't about politics. It was about survival. Some burned old uniforms, hid documents, or changed clothes. The images traveled fast. Tanks at the palace, flags over Saigon, helicopters lifting away. On American TVs, the war ended not with speeches, but with pictures: dusty roads, desperate faces, and finally, silence. For many, it was disbelief. For others, grim acceptance. The longest war in American history to that point had ended with a handshake and a photograph. There was no victory parade. No, we won. Just questions and an empty embassy roof. The numbers told a cold story. More than 58,000 Americans dead. Millions of Vietnamese, soldiers, civilians, North and South, killed or wounded. Towns erased, jungles scarred. Families were split. Some fled as refugees, becoming part of the boat people who risked everything on open seas. Others stayed, facing a new government and uncertain futures. The war ended, but its shadows didn't. April 30th, 1975, was the bookend to a conflict that had begun as whispers of a faraway struggle and grown into something that shook capitals and living rooms alike. It showed that wars can be won militarily but still leave scars, and that sometimes they are not won at all, they simply stop. For Vietnam, it was a beginning, painful and triumphant. For America, it was an ending that felt like a question mark. The image of that tank through the gate is more than a photograph. It's a reminder. Power has limits, history has long memory, and sometimes even the strongest have to leave. When the tank rolled through the presidential palace gates on April 30th, 1975, the war ended, but for millions the struggle was just beginning. A new Vietnam was being born, and with it came hope, fear, and one of the greatest refugee movements of the 20th century. For those who stayed, there was rebuilding and reckoning. For those who left, there were boats, camps, and oceans to cross. In the days after Saigon fell, the streets were quiet but tense. The new rulers, the North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front, moved fast to secure the city. Flags were changed, street names rewritten. Tanks rolled past cafes and pagodas. To many, there was relief. The war was over. The gunfire stopped. For the victors, it was liberation, reunification, a dream fulfilled after decades of struggle. But for others, soldiers, officials, translators, teachers, anyone tied to the Old South or to Americans, the future was uncertain and frightening. The new government promised forgiveness, but it also demanded conformity. Thousands of former ARVN officers, government employees, and intellectuals were sent to re-education camps. The name sounded mild. The reality was harsh. Some camps lasted months, others years. Men and women worked long days, endured lectures, and tried to survive on little food. Many didn't come back. For families, it meant separation, poverty, and fear. Homes were searched, businesses nationalized. The country's economy struggled under the weight of central planning, war damage, and isolation. By 1975, many South Vietnamese decided they could not stay. Some fled before the fall, on planes and helicopters. Others fled after by sea. They became known as the boat people, families who piled into fishing boats, makeshift rafts, anything that could float to escape. They left at night, in secret, carrying little more than what they could hold. The South China Sea was dangerous. Storms, pirates, hunger. Many boats sank. Many never reached land. Those who survived often ended up in refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, or Hong Kong, waiting for resettlement. Over time, hundreds of thousands would make it to the United States, Canada, Australia, France. They brought with them not just memories of war, but resilience, building new lives far from the Mekong Delta or Saigon's markets. For those who stayed, life was complicated. The war had devastated farms and factories. The country was poor, isolated internationally, and soon would be pulled into another conflict, the brief but brutal war with Cambodia and a border clash with China. But slowly, despite hardship, a new identity began to form. The country was now unified, but healing would take years. The younger generation grew up under one flag, taught a different version of history, one where the victor's story was the nation's story. Back in the U.S., the wars ended not erase its ghosts. Veterans came home to a country unsure how to greet them. Some faced indifference or even hostility. Others found solidarity in quiet corners. The refugee crisis brought waves of new neighbors, families with accents and memories, carrying both gratitude and loss. The U.S. itself wrestled with the legacy, memorials, books, hearings. The Vietnam Syndrome became shorthand for a country reluctant to send troops abroad. After the fall reminds us that wars don't really end on the day the shooting stops. For millions of Vietnamese, the aftermath was another war against hunger, poverty, and fear. For those who fled, it was nights on open water, prayers whispered into dark waves. It's also about the strength of people. The refugee story is not just about loss. It's about rebuilding, turning new lands into homes, carrying language and memory across oceans. And for the country they left behind, the end of war was just the start of another journey, trying to stitch together the pieces of a broken nation, and one day, turning the world's pity into something else, respect. The guns were silent, but the echoes didn't fade. For Vietnam, the war was a scar and a flag, a memory of pain and triumph. For America, it was a question mark, an open wound that demanded answers, apologies, and eventually reflection. Decades later, the two nations would see each other differently, but for a long time, looking back hurt more than it healed. In Vietnam, the end of the war was not the end of hardship. The economy struggled. Fields were mined, factories ruined, families torn apart. Re-education took fathers away, and suspicion followed those tied to the South. The government tried to build unity, but the reality was ration cards, long lines, and shortages. In the countryside, farmers planted in fields still hiding bombs. In cities, young people learned slogans, songs, and history from the victor's point of view. The story was simplified. The war was won, the Americans were beaten, the country was whole again. Yet people remembered more complicated truths. They remembered sons who died on both sides, neighbors who disappeared, kindness and cruelty mixed. Looking back was both pride and pain. In the United States, the war didn't end with victory parades. It ended with debates, hearings, and memorial walls. Congress investigated, journalists wrote, veterans spoke. The country wrestled with the idea that power had limits, that leaders could mislead, that wars could be lost. The term Vietnam Syndrome described a new caution about foreign wars. Presidents hesitated before sending troops abroad, afraid of another quagmire. The military itself rebuilt, changing tactics, training, and how it treated those who fought. And there were the veterans. Many came home to silence. Some struggled with nightmares, addictions, broken families. Others built quiet lives, carrying memories they rarely shared. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in Washington, a black granite wall with more than 58,000 names. People touched the names, left flowers, and wept. The wall was simple, but it said everything. For a long time, Vietnam and America didn't speak. The war was a political wound, and the Cold War kept them apart. But time changes things. Refugees built lives in the U.S., becoming citizens, doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs. They kept Vietnamese culture alive in places like Little Saigon in California or neighborhoods in Houston. By the 1990s, the U.S. and Vietnam began talking again. Embassies reopened, trade restarted. American tourists walked Hanoi streets, and Vietnamese students came to American universities. The war was never forgotten, but was being transformed from battlefield to bridge. What did Vietnam teach? That's a question still argued in classrooms, books, and barstools. Some say it was about limits. Even great powers can stumble when the ground shifts beneath them. Others say it was about courage and waste, about men and women asked to do impossible things in impossible places. For many Vietnamese, the war is a reminder of resilience. The country survived invasions, bombings, isolation, and found a way to move forward. For Americans, it's a reminder of responsibility, of how decisions made far away can ripple through millions of lives. History isn't a closed book. Vietnam still lingers in songs, in photos, in quiet conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. The war changed two countries, and in some ways, the world. Vietnam and America Look Back is about memory and meaning. It's about how victories can feel hollow and defeats can teach. It's about black granite walls and bustling markets, refugee kitchens and reunion hugs, a North Vietnamese flag over Saigon, and an American flag folded at a funeral. Looking back doesn't erase the past, but it lets us see it clearly. A war fought by young people who aged too soon, led by politicians who sometimes didn't know what they were asking, witnessed by a world that learned how small it really is. When the helicopters left and the last tank rolled through Saigon, it felt like an ending. But endings are never that clean. Vietnam didn't just leave behind battlefields. It left behind questions, memories, policies, and scars that are still felt decades later. The war became more than a history lesson. It became a lens through which Americans, Vietnamese, and much of the world would view power, trust, and conflict. In the years after 1975, Vietnam had to find itself again. The country was unified, but it was exhausted. Farms were ruined, cities damaged, and millions of people displaced. The victorious government faced an enormous task to turn wartime unity into peacetime progress. They tried central planning, collectivizing farms and businesses. It didn't work well. Poverty was everywhere. The country struggled to feed itself. Many of the educated and entrepreneurial had fled. Others were in re-education camps. The war with Cambodia and the brief but bloody clash with China in 1979 made things worse. But Vietnam is nothing if not resilient. By the late 1980s, the government shifted, introducing economic reforms called Doi Moi, loosening control, opening to trade, letting markets breathe. Slowly, the country began to grow. Today, Vietnam is far from perfect, but it's young, energetic, and far removed from the Hunger Years. Its people carry the memory of hardship, but they've built something from it. For the United States, Vietnam was a bruise on the national ego and a mirror to the soul. It showed that a country could have the best weapons and still be humbled by politics, geography, and willpower. It taught a generation to question authority, to read headlines with suspicion, to protest when something felt wrong. The U.S. military changed, too. No more relying on raw numbers and attrition. New doctrines stressed mobility, precision, and clarity of mission. Leaders spoke about clear objectives and exit strategies. The ghost of Vietnam followed every president into Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every war since has been haunted by the phrase, "Will this be another Vietnam?" And there were the people, the veterans. For too long, they carried the weight quietly. Some were ignored, some faced hostility. But over time, the country learned to honor their service even while questioning the war. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, a simple black wall cut into the earth, became a place of healing. Visitors trace names with their fingers, leave flowers, dog tags, photos. It's not a monument to victory. It's a monument to memory. Millions fled after the war, scattering across the globe. They brought Vietnam to Houston, Paris, Sydney, Orange County. They built businesses, taught children, opened restaurants with steaming bowls of pho and banh mi. For those who left, the war was never just history. It was a family story. They carried it in language, in music, in the careful way they saved things because they once had to leave everything behind. And for their children, born far from the Mekong, it became a lesson that home can be carried in the heart, even if the address changes. Was Vietnam winnable? Should America have stayed out? Was it a noble cause or a tragic mistake? These questions still fill books and classrooms. The war was not just a fight against communism. It was a clash of cultures, ideas, and ambitions. What's clear is that war is never just soldiers and maps. It's families, farmers, translators, nurses, journalists. It's trust given and broken, courage found and sometimes lost. It's about power, yes, but also about people. The legacy of Vietnam is not one thing. It's many things. It's the photograph of a helicopter on a rooftop, and it's a bowl of noodles in a California strip mall. It's a quiet wall in Washington and a noisy street in Hanoi. It's a warning to politicians and a tribute to those who carried the burden. When people say Vietnam, they mean a war, a country, a time, a lesson. They mean bravery and mistakes, pain and resilience. They mean the sound of rotor blades and the whisper of waves carrying refugees. And maybe that's the real legacy, that history is not neat. It doesn't end when the last shot is fired. It lives on, in people, in choices, in the things we build afterward.